Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 288 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on March 29th, 2025. This is the official podcast for the fan site AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So on today's show, we are going to have our big review, discussion, analysis for the new Avatar comic that came out earlier this week, Ashes of the Academy. But before that, we do have some news to get into, including some pretty big news. And we're going to start off with what, just from an outside view looking in, should be the biggest piece of news of the week, but it's probably the weakest piece of news of the week, and that is Realms Collide basically had its full launch. It's not out everywhere yet, but it's out in most of the major regions. I think it's mostly just some Asian territories they still have to get to, that they're just a little bit behind on, but ultimately the game has now officially released. I think it was March 18th was the full-on official date for the game finally coming out after all of this waiting. Like, it pretty much took a full year from when they started marketing to finally getting the game out. And yeah, it's here, and unfortunately I don't think there's that much to say, because I think the general reception of the game has been that, most Avatar fans, this isn't really the game for them. And even if you are inclined to maybe like this sort of game, it really depends on if you're invested in this sort of, kind of city building, alliance building game, gaining territory, that sort of thing. There's unfortunately just not a lot here if you're here more for the Avatar stuff. The story is kind of non-existent. There's not even that many characters in the game. It's a bit unfortunate. I don't think the game is like actively bad. It seems like a solid enough one of these games, but certainly compared to like some of the initial footage that I saw from like 9 months ago and stuff like that, it doesn't really look like that much has changed either. So I think there's just a lot of confusion about like, oh wow, like what's happening here? There's nothing super exciting going on with this. That's kind of my main thoughts, is just that, hey, we're an Avatar podcast. We typically cover everything. And it's kind of crazy that we're probably going to be done in like 3 minutes covering this. But what are your thoughts, Greg, on this? I think you told me earlier that you haven't actually played it yet, which is probably a fair enough decision given what the reception has been so far. But what are your thoughts on what you've seen of it so far?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen a couple of things and people talking about it, but not that much, honestly. A lot of it is from like sort of your community that at least attempted to try it. Even on Reddit, I haven't seen that much or anything about it. I did try to get into it. I actually had an error getting into the game, even though it said it was available in my region and everything. I did get into it, but I didn't really get a chance or time to really want to do much more in the game. It looks like something that, like, people were really into, a while ago. Like, it's the type of mobile game that, has the potential to be popular, and at a time that was like the height of popularity of those type of games on mobile. But even now, I think even on mobile, that's not really the sort of, current popular, meta of like mobile games to try to get people to play and then they get out of it or anything like that. So I don't know. It was an interesting decision for them to go with this sort of game. And yeah, we know it was, announced a while ago, and I'm sure it was in development even before that. But, just from that sort of standpoint, it doesn't really feel like this was something that really needed to be an Avatar game. I guess, they got the license and they thought it could, sort of do well off of that. But I don't know, just having a brand name on something doesn't necessarily make it a good game.
Indeed. I think that most of the reaction to this has been like, oh, can we get Avatar Generations back? Like, that was a bit of a miss when that game kind of went down, because it was about to go into some pretty interesting content, which this new game doesn't even look like it has the ability to do that sort of stuff. They said they had this whole non-canon story. There's no story really in the game. It's pretty baffling on that side of things. I'm sticking with it because it is one of those games that, like, once you kind of play it for a decent bit, you kind of just log in, click a few things, activate a few timers, go away, come back, do the next timers, that sort of thing. So it's pretty hands-off in that sense, at the very least. You don't have to put tons of time in to stay quote unquote up to date. But we'll move away from that into much more exciting news. This is something that a bunch of months ago, we thought we would never hear anything about it, but now it was actually an expected announcement, and it finally happened. Beasts of the Four Nations has at last been re-announced. So we have a proper announcement for this, the deluxe edition of Beasts of the Four Nations. We have a date, and most of the extra new information is just that, like, for instance, we have a writer attached now. It's John O'Brien, one of the writers from ATLA. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same sort of information that we had when the book was first announced nearly 4 years. So yeah, Beasts of the Four Nations, creatures from Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra. The cover is slightly different than we had the first time, just in the sense that the titling has been kind of adjusted in terms of font. They have an Avatar logo on it, and the tagline's actually on the front cover. The more interesting stuff is probably with the deluxe set, where they have changed the image on the box, and they've also changed what the lithograph is for the deluxe edition. It's now this pretty cool cabbage merchant with his ostrich horses image, which is very nice, and it's our only real insight into maybe some of the interior art. Other information would just be that the release date is September 23rd/24th this year, so we don't actually have to wait too long for it, which is exciting. And I guess we have a confirmed page count of 128 pages. Otherwise, it's all the usual stuff where they're describing it as being a part art and part lore book. We still don't know what exact way it's going to be laid out in terms of like how much information, what type of information we're going to get, but they are teasing that it does have that ability to give information on animals from Avatar and Korra as well as spirits. So exciting stuff that it's finally at last coming out. It's a big reveal for Dark Horse, and it will be a big release when it happens. But what are your thoughts on this? We've been anticipating it for a while now. It's finally announced.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm glad that it's finally coming out after all these years and people can, finish their collections with the spine and everything. That's always been a thing for many people with them keeping up with these. So I don't know. I mean, I think, it's sad that it's kind of taken this long to, sort of come out, but it sounds like from, the new updated description, everything that they're really trying to make it that something's worthwhile, which I think, it always had that potential to be. I think that's why we were so sort of, excited for it when it was announced all those years ago.
Mm-hmm. They, in the official announcements, they made no mention of the fact that this was announced 4 years ago. It was fully treated as if this is the first time we're ever hearing about it. No one's really saying anything about the mistake, quote unquote, that happened all those years ago. But like, even framing it as a mistake is a bit like, what? Like, it was up everywhere. Like, most places had pre-orders up for this book. It was a bit of a mess. I think it's clear at this point that it was probably something to do with Avatar Studios, because like it was announced May 2021, a few months after Avatar Studios was announced. And given that we know what happened to like the comics and how long they've taken to kind of get back on track, I'm guessing this book was just put on hold for basically the core of like 2.5 years, because I kind of get the impression a lot of the artists who are now saying that they've worked on this book only came on board probably within the last kind of couple of years, rather than, oh, this 4-year-old work that I did is now finally coming out. So I do think that the idea seems to be the book was just completely put on hold for multiple years. But what's your take on that, given that this is a really long cycle of initial announcement to secondary announcement?
Yeah, that is curious that you say that at least in terms of the artists who are more public about, sort of their involvement in the project do seem, relatively new, which does make you wonder. I think that is a good point, that maybe it was really just sort of put on hold and it was just a too early announcement, which just seems to be sort of like a trend in general of how they sort of do things now in terms of entertainment and media, which I don't think a lot of people are jiving with these days. But yeah, that is kind of just sort of unfortunate. I mean, I think, you're probably right. It is just the timing of when it came out, it just sort of conflicted with everything, and the solo comments and everything like that. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised that this one had sort of that sort of effect to it as well. It just sort of was a a bigger project, so it couldn't sort of pivot to do something like what the comics did, where they just sort of went solo on them. This required a lot more sort of effort on it. But I don't know. I am curious to wonder if there is going to be, if we'll be able to tell when we get the book or when it sort of comes out fully, which sort of parts of it were created, many years ago versus which ones were more sort of recent. That'll be something telling to find out.
Yeah, because at the very least, like the cover is 4 years old. Other stuff we're not super sure about. The page count I think is sort of notable because maybe it was just placeholder listing information, which sometimes is the case with page count. But I believe the old listings it was much closer to 200 pages. So I don't know if I'd say with confidence that like the book's been kind of like diminished in scope or something like that, or this was always the intent. This is where we'll have to wait and see like how in depth it is. Like, does this cover every animal that we see in Avatar and Korra, and what does it mean for animals that aren't covered here, that sort of thing. But yeah, I would have appreciated a preview page at least coming out with this, just to show like what actually the format of the book is. But I guess we'll get that in maybe like the next month or two, building up to some of that stuff happening. But it's another book to add to the list of stuff coming out this year, where this release date puts it like in an interesting spot where like it's after the kids novel Light It Up, Bending Academy, but it's before Awakening of Roku. So you can see the publishing like really building up towards the end of the year, and then like after that, a lot of the Avatar paint with water books, the sticker book, and the build up to Avatar Studios stuff is going to happen at that point. So interesting stuff there. And yeah, this looks like the sort of book where if there's enough information on it, we might have to do like a podcast about it, which sometimes with this more lore-based stuff is maybe difficult to do. But if they have proper information on animals, this could be quite interesting depending on how they do it. So that's exciting. September 23rd/4th again is the release. And as far as we're aware, the deluxe edition is going to complete the spine image stuff. They don't really mention that in particular because I suppose it's marketing from like the first deluxe set from so many years ago, but it should. It'd be crazy if it doesn't complete the set after all these years. But anyway, the last piece of news we have is weird because it's news that we already know, and technically there is no new news in this article. Variety put up an article. It says Steven Yeun joins Paramount's untitled animated Aang Avatar film exclusive. When you go through it, all it says is that he has joined the movie. It is not clear yet which of the four nations his character basically hails from. Character details are being kept under wraps. And then it's just recap of all the information we have on the movie, January 30th, the other actors that we know from before. They do acknowledge that he worked on Avatar previously as Wan, of course, and a bunch of his other work that he's done, and that's it. There's no real information as to like, well, what's their source on this as an exclusive piece of news. They don't mention the fact that we've known about this for months from the copyright listing information where he was just randomly mentioned in there. And it's funny that official copyright information that has like the same info here. What's this about? The only thing that I think we've come to the conclusion of is the timing of this feels notable, given that CinemaCon is next week. It's only a few days away. That they've given us a little bit of a teaser here of one of the more notable actors in the movie. And then, in a way, who's the only known main character who's in the movie who doesn't have an actor? Zuko. Are they building up to maybe this is one of the CinemaCon announcements, is confirming Steven Yeun is Zuko, which I think is what most people are beginning to settle towards more, that the Zuko kind of actor issue has ran on this long. But what are your thoughts on this? Variety putting up a news article that doesn't really have much news, and the timing of it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the CinemaCon reference, that sort of makes sense if they're, this is, I don't know, another, iteration of them trying to get sort of news and info out about the movie and stuff like that. But again, just the fact that it says, untitled, animated Aang Avatar film, that just, I don't know, that doesn't, it doesn't really bode well or anything, or it doesn't really, evoke a lot of emotion in it because, we know something's coming. There's, prospective names on what it is. There's listings in other places. A lot of these sites have already sort of like, talked about the suspected names and stuff like that. So I don't know. It's always weird when we get these sort of official releases about things that we sort of already know, but granted, it's not all of it's sort of out there in the wider sort of web and stuff like that. Like you have to sort of be into it to sort of know it. So I guess from that perspective, this is a little bit more out there, in terms of getting the people, but in general, like what purpose does it serve other than to just garner, news and stuff like that, which is fine if it's going to lead up to something. So I do hope that it does coincide with something from CinemaCon and that's sort of, I don't know, another begin of their sort of cycle of news and promotional material, maybe. I mean, if that's the case, then, I'm all for it, even if it doesn't really mean too much to me personally. So I don't know. It could mean the beginning of something, but I don't know. We've seen this sort of done before without much direction afterwards.
Hmm. One thing I did note is I saw some people post about this on social media. Jessica Matten and Roman Zaragoza, who are Katara and Sokka in the movie, did post about this. Like they kind of, I guess, like Instagram story kind of linked the Variety article, which to me at least gives maybe the impression that this is not some sort of a like Variety got like a scoop in a way where like they rooted out information that wasn't meant to be public. That almost gives the impression that like, oh, Paramount slipped them a bit of a teaser announcement maybe type thing. Because Variety are usually like the place you go to for like the official stuff. Like they get all the press releases, and this feels a little bit like you were officially told this kind of type thing, weren't you? We'll see how it goes, because I suppose that's maybe the last thing in the news section to talk about is just CinemaCon is coming up. April 3rd is going to be the day when potential Avatar news happens, because that's when the Paramount panel is. And again, we expect the movie to be there. It was here at the event the last 2 years. Now there's this little bit of a teaser ahead of time. And like you alluded to, like the stuff like official Variety news article about this movie, and it still has the really awkwardly worded, untitled animated Aang Avatar film. Not even Aang the Last Airbender, which we did hear about as the working title from before. No mention of that stuff. Stuff like that, I think, has to be confirmed coming out of CinemaCon. Like, we have to know what the movie's actually called. If not, I don't know what on earth is happening. Like, that needs to be confirmed. I guess some more voice actor news is going to happen. And I think you need to put out some sort of a visual. Even if it's just like the logo, there needs to be just that 1-2 combo of official title and some sort of a visual. So places like Variety can stop using those kind of early stock images of Avatar to like do all their articles with. Just the basics. Like I'm not expecting a giant blowout here at all. I do think they will be probably shown a clip or something like that. We'll get a description of whatever that is. It's just all about what Paramount decide is public information kind of coming out of this, which might be, I guess, more information, which, I think we need to know who the Zuko actor is coming out of this. And I'd be shocked if at this point it's like, and surprise, it's Dante Bosco, and everyone's like, okay. I kind of assumed that, like, if, that's the normal expectation, but, Stephen Ewan probably is that's the case in this case. But, I suppose, what are your expectations now? This will be our last time being able to talk about it before CinemaCon happens. What are your expectations for news at this event?
It's a good one. I mean, depending on how, considering when things are going to come out and everything, I mean, I think the idea of a clip is pretty, key on them sort of showing there, or I don't know, I expect them to have some sort of motion, whatever, tests or whatever, or maybe a full, mini trailer to show there more than, anything that we'll probably see from the sort of outside of things, unless, of course, it gets leaked or something like that again, which, we know has happened in the past. But regardless, I expect them to pretty much report on, whatever it is that they show in pretty good sort of detail there. I don't know. I do wonder how much, they would sort of let, officially out or anything like that, depending on how far along they are with it. But I don't know. For everything with the movie so far, it really feels like they're keeping things very sort of close in terms of,
Yeah.
it coming out and sort of production and stuff like that. So I don't know. I guess I wouldn't particularly be surprised if we get sort of very little out of it, at least sort of officially, from this sort of event, just because of how they've been doing things. And just, movies in general, they tend to be sort of close-lipped about things. So I
Yeah.
don't know. I guess I wouldn't be too surprised if there isn't much for fans directly out of this.
Yeah, it's the interesting point of like, yeah, the Paramount don't tend to properly market their movies until much closer to release. Trailers for like Sonic, Transformers, I think their new Smurfs movie are only happening like 4 or 5 months before release. So we're not expecting like a public trailer at all right now because we're still 9 months out, and that's assuming there isn't any sort of a delay. Um, and I think that's probably one of the other things here is just like, are we expecting the date to change? Because everyone's pointed out that January 30th is maybe not the best date. Movies coming out in January, it's a bit of a weird kind of slot. Will they change that? I think my assumption for a while has been that like it won't be locked in at January 30th. It will change. How much it will change, I think, is really telling. Because I'm not going to mind too much if they alter this and it's a few weeks, or it changes into a February or a March date. It gets a little bit more frustrating, I think, if we're pushing it like I think further beyond that, and like it's suddenly May or June, and it's much more in the second half of the year. It feels like it just resets things back to, okay, we have to build up to it being a year to go again, that sort of thing. But yeah, I can see stuff like that happening, in that like I think they need to get some of the basic information out about the movie to just get it in people's heads that the movie's called this, here's some sort of a visual, and here's the official date as of this new piece of news. Just they need to hit those type of things where this information can then be put up on all the different websites. The social medias can actually talk about it because it's fully locked in information. The website can maybe finally have a section about the movie type thing. That's, I think, what's needed at this point, because I think I've said it and worded it in this way for a while now. They need to make the movie feel real, and I think for a while it hasn't really felt like super real, because there's nothing super concrete out there about the movie, and there is expectations here. I think people know what to expect and what not to expect, but like, we do expect to hear an update, I think, here, and it would be weird if we don't. In part because of this kind of Stephen Yeun kind of half announcement here, where it's nothing, and it only means something if they add in the next bit, which is and who's he's playing. Even then, it's like, okay, you've confirmed, I suppose, at that point that like what you've recast the entire Team Avatar, that's fine and all. But we still need actual concrete information on the movie. So we'll see what happens. It is a pretty exciting thing. And I suppose depending on how big it is, we might have a podcast next week to kind of go over it. Or we might wait a little bit longer to cover it. But yes, that has been the news. And from there, we'll move into our main topic for the episode, which is going to be our review for the new Avatar The Last Airbender comic that came out just earlier this week on Tuesday and Wednesday. Ashes of the Academy. So this is Avatar one-shot comic number 6. So it completes the second trilogy of Avatar one-shot comics, along with Azula in the Spirit Temple, The Bounty Hunter and the Tea-Brewer. Ashes of the Academy is the third and final book in that collection. In the same way that the first 3 are collected into Team Avatar Treasury, at some point we expect to hear a book announced that is, I'm guessing, Fire Nation something or other, and it's these 3 books in one. That's the way they work these. So we'll go over the creative team here, and then we'll get into some opinions. So Ashes of the Academy, script written by Faith Erin Hicks, art by Peter Wortman, colors by Adele Matera, lettering by Richard Starkings, and Comic Crafts Jimmy Betten. With the usual stuff like special thanks to Mike Bryan, Joan Hilty at Avatar Studios. It went through approvals. It's an official book, that whole situation. But yeah, let's get into some opinions. I'll lead us off with just the idea that I've had this book for a while now because I got an early review copy, and from all that time ago, back in like December, all the way up to now, I think this is a fantastic book. I think it's pretty clearly, for me, the best Avatar one-shot comic, and I guess best one-shot comic in general, even including the Mako one. I think it's the one that I think best uses the page count in a pretty clean and solid way. It's a Mei-focused comic, which I think is important to state, and they do a great job with Mei. Mei is characterized, I think, so well here. This feels like a very important comic for Mei, that if you like Mei as a character, you have to read this because of where they take the character, and there's so many great moments for her. But you get a bit of Zuko, which is nice. Key's in this, her appearing in a comic for the first time in a while. That's nice to see. Plus there's some Ursa. And even though Azula is only in this in flashback, she kind of has a presence over the whole book that I also think is pretty well done also. Not to mention the whole kind of gimmick idea of this comic about the Royal Fire Academy for girls. That's developed really well as also, where we know bits and pieces about it, but now we have a much better sense about what it's about. So I just really think this is a super strong book. Usual things, I think, with one-shot comics where it's always difficult to, I think, wrap up everything neatly, make it feel like everything's been covered in the right level of detail when you only have 72 pages and it has to be focused on one or two things. But I think this one, I come out of it feeling like, no, this is a pretty clean 72 pages. Of course, it could have been more if they had more time, but I like what's here quite a lot. But what are your overall thoughts, Greg, on Ashes of the Academy?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I was surprised by how much I was sort of interested in this once I sort of started getting into actually reading it. I wasn't necessarily, sure what it was going to be about. She's an interesting character. She has, a personality that you either can sort of jive with or cannot, but you can sort of, she's just a sort of odd, interesting character. So from that aspect, it's always cool to get sort of more of her, her inner thoughts, so she keeps everything sort of so close to herself in terms of what she sees and what she thinks. So it was cool to sort of get that sort of understanding from her character's point of view, sort of her upbringing and how she actually had to sort of deal with things. And, whenever you get a story that does have, flashbacks in it that are done, well, at least, I think that's always, sort of a good thing to see, and it fleshes out a lot of things that we, haven't really got to experience before. And, the Fire Nation Academy for Girls, I think is, this windows things that, three of our, most popular characters from the show are really sort of involved with, and, has a lineage and a history to it that, the Fire Nation has built up upon over the years. So it's something that's really cool to get to see sort of fleshed out. So, it's something neat to see, and to get to see, people's sort of responses. I feel like this one has really got people sort of talking about it a lot more than a lot of the other sort of one-shot comics, for good and for bad. Not everyone, sort of is 100% cool with how this sort of deals with the characters, or more so how, how it sort of frames Azula. So, there's varying sort of opinions on stuff like that. But I think it's good that, at least people are talking about it in some way or fashion, because a lot of the other sort of one-shots, they sort of have sort of come and gone. Like there's not much about them. Usually they take forever to get here, and then when they come here, there's not much to them that, continues with the story or the future of things. And I think this one, actually does that. Like, it doesn't have Aang or anything like that, but I think for what it's going for, and especially with it dealing with the Fire Nation, which is something that we don't always have a lot of, especially in chorus time, it's cool to get to see sort of more of that, and, to bring back characters that have been sort of new fan favorites just from the comics alone. It's always interesting to see what they do with them, especially since they don't have a lot of, history on their own. So there's, maybe more leeway you can do with them. So I don't know. I thought it was cool. I like, Key as a character. I can see how some people might be upset by her sort of, introduction into the series and stuff like that. But, I don't know. For me, that sort of makes it a little bit more sort of, real world-ish, which I get not everyone wants in their sort of fiction. But I don't know. For me, it worked out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, it is a good point that, like, they chose the right characters for this book. That immediately got people excited. The second you had those Fire Nation teen characters on the cover, and people knew it was like, oh, it's a sequel to a certain degree to Smoke and Shadow. That immediately grabs people's attention for a variety of reasons, because it's Mei and Zuko on the cover. Is this book going to do anything with their relationship? It's about the Academy. Azula went to the Academy, so she's in play. Ty Lee in play. not to mention, Ursa, Guy, and so on. It's you're covering characters that are interesting and relate to what the main open plot points are. Because even though maybe Dark Horse and Avatar Studios don't want us as fans to feel this way, we want the notable comics. We want the big stories, and you have to approach them in a way like this, where it's an impactful story. It's not just a random look at the Academy. No, it's a significant look at the Academy using the correct characters. And yeah, these are also the characters where people are very passionate about them, and so the opinions are a bit all over the place. Are a lot of those opinions super valid sometimes? Not necessarily, but we'll get into it. We'll discuss this stuff as we go through. So yeah, let's go through this. So again, grab your copy of the book if you're listening to this. Follow along with us, because we're basically going to be going through it sort of page by page, scene by scene. We want to do the really in-depth breakdown and not just vaguely kind of go through the book. So we open up the Royal Fire Academy. Everyone's waiting outside for the doors to open because it's basically the first day of term, and it's actually Key's first day of school, as we find out. So before Key even gets introduced, it's actually a scene of Ursa and Zuko talking, because they're there because Key is attending. And he asks his mother, "Are you all right?" She says she's just being a mom, worrying about how her youngest daughter will do in this school. Zuko urges her not to worry, but Ursa brings up the point that she regretted sending Azula here to the Academy. The Academy really brought out the worst in her. I'm not sure Key should be here either. Zuko points out that it's different now than it was in the past. Trust him as the Fire Lord, that he's making an effort to protect the new generation of students. You can believe in me. And so Zuko opens the gates to start the new term, I guess, at the Academy, the new era of the Academy. So very interesting opening scene straight away. Beautiful shot of the Academy itself, and we're straight in with Ursa and Zuko. What are your thoughts on these opening 2 pages?
Yeah, this is, I thought this was a cool way to sort of set the stage for the story. And there's, even more that we get to when they're sort of discussing the Academy. But I don't know. I think, them starting off with a mention of Azula is always going to get, a lot of people noted about sort of, what's really this Academy about. I mean, I think, the setup for it and the scene of it, I think is really cool. They did a really good job on sort of, drawing the Academy, especially, since we know a bit about it, but I don't think we have like a really good sort of sense of this sort of setup and stuff like that. So that was definitely really cool to see. But yeah, it's interesting to see that, at least from the kids' perspective, they're excited for it, but the parents are sort of, having thoughts, or at least Ursa's having thoughts about sort of her history with this.
Yeah, like it's a really good opening 2 pages, because it immediately introduces kind of like the theme, the premise of the book, which is to compare and contrast the Academy now with effectively the era when Azula and co went there, which is basically just meant to represent it at all times, basically, in the past. This immediately is maybe where some of the controversy comes in, but I think it's mainly just from, I think certain groups of fans just have weird views on Ursa. And it's been here since The Search, like over 10 years ago, 12 years ago when The Search came out. And it's kind of just been the same thing since. And it's just the idea that certain fans who are really into Azula just seem to be very hypercritical of Ursa over everything. And I think it's just weird that, this is, I think, a very normal scene. I think Ursa acts completely fine. She talks about the right things. She's worried about Key attending right now, but does reflect on Azula and what the Academy, its role that it played in Azula turning out how she did. And the people immediately interpreting this somehow as she's deflecting blame away from herself. Like, she doesn't blame herself for, Azula's faults. And it's like, well, in this case, it's the truth to a certain degree. It's not that Ursa's perfect in regards to her handling of Azula and that key dynamic for Azula. But I do think sometimes it is forgotten that, Ozai, and as the book makes the point here, and the Academy together are the kind of 1-2 combo that makes it so that, yeah, there was kind of no getting Azula back from that, ultimately, given the family dynamic, where Ursa doesn't have the power in the family that I think a lot of people maybe think she does. Because again, remember the search, remember the backstory, that Ursa's a victim of Ozai as well. Even the line of her saying, like, I regretted sending Azula here. I don't think Ursa had any say in that decision. I think Ozai made that decision. It was just locked in the second she was a firebender that she was going here. And even if Ursa had voiced concerns, I don't think they would have been listened to. And it's just, I think, Ursa reflecting on the idea that this is one of the moments where, you know, a few of the key moments in that kind of history where she lost Azula at this point to a certain degree. And I think that's perfectly fine, because ultimately Ursa's only in this one scene at the start. She's only in like the next few pages as well. It's not here to have the exploration properly of this. I just think this is a fine reference to everything that's happening here, that it makes sense to bring Azula up a little bit here, to set the stage that she's going to be involved in the rest of the book. But like, I don't really see why this has to be a heavily criticized scene. And again, it is only from a certain group of fans, but what are your thoughts on that? And I suppose just the broader thing of just, you know, certain fans being hypercritical of Ursa as a character.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. From some perspective, I can see where they're going for, but you know, there is sort of many things that I don't even think we've, you know, fully sort of explored in the comics yet, to, you know, why Azula is the way that she is. And, you know, even from this comic where they do touch on it later on, you know, it doesn't really give us any sort of hard rules. And, you know, there may not ever be any sort of hard rules on that sort of aspect. But, you know, from Ursa's perspective, you know, she views at least that this school wasn't necessarily a way of sort of helping, you know, maybe sort of curb some of Azula's already sort of, you know, ingrained tendencies that have, you know, we're presuming have been sort of, you know, taught to her by Ozai. Because, you know, from what we're seeing here, it seems like, you know, she had a lot of those sort of, you know, I don't know, you could say tendencies already, you know, from the time that they started school at this sort of academy. So those had to come from somewhere, and it definitely feels like the environment, which I think is the whole point of this comic here, you know, this academy wasn't really geared towards, you know, anything but that sort of perspective, which is sort of, you know, the history and sort of the issue that the Fire Nation has and Zuko's trying to combat in this one. So I think it at least does, you know, a job to sort of attempt to sort of show that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's interesting. I think some of it might just be part of this, you know, Ursa and just sort of Key as a combo there, just them as sort of characters and sort of how this sort of reflects on sort of Azula's sort of upbringing in general and how sort of different Key seems to be in that sort of perspective. But Key also had a different father, so there's a whole, you know, thing there to consider as well.
Yeah, immediately as we turn the page, Key gets introduced, the doors are open, everyone runs in. Key's very excited. Come on, mommy, school's about to begin. And Ursa follows her in. She talks to her friend Liwa here. They kind of race into the kind of jungle gym type thing going on. And Ursa notes that she's so glad that Liwa is here with her. It means a lot. I suppose we should have a quick sidebar on who Liwa is, because interestingly, when the preview pages for this book first came out, there was a mistake on them where they kept in writer commentary, I guess, from an earlier stage of production on the book, and it mentioned that, like, I think it's Faith Aaron Hicks writing it, and it obviously says it's something along the lines of, in my mind, I view Liwa as being one of the girls that Key was held captive with in Smoke and Shadow, with the idea being of, like, I guess that got approved because it's in the book now that, like, Liwa are friends and they're kind of like known friends, and that's the kind of idea here. Because I don't think she was named in Smoke and Shadow, so now Liwa gets named here, which is kind of fun. So that's a cool little detail. But yeah, what we get here is Zuko says, I'm glad she's here too. The school should have opened its door to all Fire Nation citizens long ago. And Ursa, in kind of quotes mocking this, is like, but if all children were allowed to go to the Royal Fire Academy, it would undermine our great country's traditions. We can't have that. And And Zuko just notes that, it's time for some new traditions, like teaching the Academy students exactly what happened during the 100-Year War and the Fire Nation's role. And Ursa just notes that I don't think the parents are going to be super excited about that, or at least certain few parents are going to be excited about that. But it's a nice little conversation here as we kind of run in. But yeah, this is the introduction of Key into the book. We initially thought this was a Key one-shot until Faith Erin Hicks actually said it was more May focused. Key, surprisingly, I suppose, isn't the super focus of this book. She gets a few key scenes obviously quite early on, but it does quickly shift to being very May focused kind of early on. It's nice to see her again because it is her first comic, I believe, since Smoke and Shadow, which is 9 years ago at this point. So there was maybe some slight worry about is she never going to appear in a comic again? So it's nice to see that she has appeared here. But what are your thoughts on this page here? The mocking of the old Academy rules, and that one of the ones they're immediately breaking is that it's not just for noble daughters.
Yeah, I mean, that feels on par with what Zuko has, said he's going to do, so he's following through with that. So I don't know. I think it's interesting to see, him sort of change the sort of, or at least attempt to change this sort of dynamic, and to see all the pushback that's going to sort of come from it, because that's a pretty big thing, and especially when we learned that this has been done for 1,000, 2,000 years or whatever of Fire Nation history. That's a pretty big sort of change to sort of try to sort of overturn here. So I don't know. I think it definitely is going to create some interesting dynamics, and even Zuko probably isn't fully aware of sort of what he's actually doing here. So I don't know. It's cool to see.
I do like Zuko just being very confident about this. He's aware there are concerns, but he's no, this is the right thing to do. And there's not really the worry that you would say maybe a early comic Zuko would have about making a decision like this. He's made it and he's sticking to it, and that's a really good show of his development, that he just stands his ground and comes up with a plan here to make sure it's going to be enforced, which is what introduces May into the comic. But going into the next page, Ursa asks, are the parents on board with your plans? They weren't thrilled about the new curriculum, but they'll come around. Fortunately, kids are more open-minded than adults, and he feels that, okay, the adults might need some convincing, but when the kids gradually adapt to what this is and they come home happier, I guess maybe the parents will change their minds. Because it's an interesting one at the top of the page. You see the contrast between the noble parents and then I suppose the common folk parents, and there's a bit of a standoff outside because I guess they've rarely interacted before now, but now suddenly their kids are going to the same school. This is unheard of in the Fire Nation at all. So it's an interesting one that definitely comes overall. But Ursa says, I know the school is something he needs. She needs to be with kids her own age and to learn how to firebend properly. But I keep thinking about Azula. When was it that I actually lost her? Was it when she first showed her firebending skills and Ozai started molding her into the kind of child he wanted? Or did I lose her when she first walked through those doors? The way the Fire Nation students were thought to treat each other, I don't want Ki dealing with that. And Zuko just notes that Ki isn't Azula. She'll be okay. I hope so. So another very interesting page here. This time, Ursa states it, I think, quite clearly. These are the moments that she views it as. These were the two things that happened in kind of Azula's life, where she realized that she couldn't have as much of an impact on her as she would have wanted to. And we literally saw the first moment she alludes to in Azula in the Spirit Temple. We saw that scene of Ozai basically announcing Azula as a firebender to Ursa, and we saw that scared reaction, and we got the whole idea of, was she scared of her, for her? We know it was kind of for her in this case, because it's clear that she felt like she lost her at that point. But also going to the academy, given what we're about to learn about the academy, and what she kind of alludes to without saying it there, how they're thought to treat each other, which is basically be suspicious of everyone, prepared to take down everyone around you, and don't have actual kind of friends. She doesn't want that for Ki. And that was a key part of Azula's downfall, is only having loyalty through that kind of way of doing things. Again, people I think will highlight this panel as well, why doesn't she mention anything about herself and her own relationship with Azula. But it's also sort of the idea of, I don't think Ursa formed Azula into what she is. The issue between Ursa and Azula is the sense of like, kind of, did Ursa do enough for Azula given the circumstances? You know, as Noriko says in The Search, like, I'm sorry I didn't love you enough. That sort of idea. It's not that Ursa's responsible for like having Azula turn out this way. In many ways, she did her best to kind of counter this by a bunch of the scenes that we have of her kind of scolding Azula for her poor behavior, which she clearly doesn't get at the Academy, which is a notable detail as well. But what are your thoughts here on page 8?
Yeah, I don't know. This is, it's really interesting to see Ursa sort of think about sort of her history with Azula and sort of what was, really the point where she lost her. And I don't know, could she have done more? Would she have had, any sort of control over sort of, Azula's firebending training, or anything sort of that, sort of area when she was, young enough to be sort of more influenced? I don't know. I wonder, this is along the lines of like, how much control did she have in raising her kids at that point? Like, Zuko being not the prodigy was just sort of left to the wayside, and thus she was able to have more influence on him. Or could she have done more in the beginning before Azula was sort of seen as such a prodigy and sort of was taken under Ozai's wing, more or less? I mean, I don't know. I wonder sort of, what the sort of exact sort of, you could say ages and, enough influence they could have had on that to sort of change the sort of outcomes of things. I don't know. I think, there probably is, a way that, Ursa could sort of reflect more on that. But I think, for the purposes of what they're going for here, this is one of the major sort of tipping points, even if, just going to school and sort of being in that sort of environment isn't necessarily potentially going to change everything about you. But, we can see it does have a huge influence here on at least these younger kids, and at least the earlier development in this sort of academy here.
And I think the other point is just that, like, I don't think every time Ursa talks about Azula, she has to blame herself at all times for that. Whenever in the future, like, Azula and Ursa have the big reunion scene we maybe expect, of course, I do think Ursa is going to apologize to Azula for not doing enough. But I think the reality of it is that, like, I do think some fans almost expect superhero qualities and tendencies from Ursa when we know the environment that, like, Ursa was in. That did she, like, you kind of brought up the question of, like, how much control did she have over this stuff? As far as we're aware, not much. Like, look how petty and cruel Ozai was over, like, the situation in The Search. Imagine Ursa had actually put in effort to almost, like, deprogram Azula. Then Azula goes back to Ozai, tells him what her mom was doing. Azula probably gets in trouble for listening to her mom, and Ursa probably gets in trouble from Ozai. That I do think Ozai at times almost, for whatever reason, goes under the radar in the discussion about some of this stuff. It often gets just brushed to the side as if he wasn't the be all end all of, like, why everything happened in that family, and that he, like, all the characters are victims of his. But it's just, it's a very nuanced situation across the board. Like, the Ursa as a mother to Azula is so complicated because, she sees her daughter with this really bad behavior, and she has to do what she can to show love despite Azula acting terribly in some of these situations. And it feels like it's just this kind of lose-lose situation of, like, what she meant to do. And it speaks to just the overall, like, tragedy of the whole family dynamic, that it's amazing that things have turned out as they are, where there is actually some hope to get Azula back on side at some point in the future, hopefully. But we'll move on. We continue on with this. Ursa says, "I just can't help but worry about my sweet, brave little girl." Zuko says, "We'll be looking out for her. How about I introduce you to the Academy headmistress, and that might ease whatever worries you have." So we are now introduced to the current headmistress of the Academy, Headmistress Shihan. And so she's honored that Zuko would attend the first day of school at the academy, and he's eager to start a new chapter. She says that she's looking forward to molding the minds of a new generation of Fire Nation children, just as her mentor, the previous headmistress, did, and that she hopes that she can be half the teacher Headmistress Pearl was. She received accolades from Fire Lord Ozai during his reign, and Zuko just points out the school will be a different place than it was under my father. This is where we get into the actual plot here of like what's actually happening here. Why does Zuko need to monitor the academy so much? Shihan says, "I've read your new curriculum thoroughly, Fire Lord, and I have reservations. The Academy must not coddle its students. They are, after all, the future of the Fire Nation." Zuko stands his ground and says that the changes I've set forth aren't coddling. I'm trying to ensure the Fire Nation's future as well, a future that looks very different from what my father imagined. I expect you to follow my instructions despite whatever reservations you may have. And we just kind of get back to looking at the kids. And interestingly, we end the page with Ki asking Liwa, "Are you excited for the new school year?" And Liwa says, "No, I'm scared." And we'll, I think, pick up on this in the next page. Which sort of, I suppose, the idea here to a certain degree. But what are your thoughts here? The introduction of Headmistress Shihan here, who's quite an important character in this.
Yeah, this was definitely something of note to see sort of her initial sort of reactions to Zuko's sort of adjustment to her curriculum. And, she's been around for a while, as we later sort of learn. So she has sort of a history and understanding of the sort of past traditions. But, she doesn't seem, that old that she's completely without sort of ability to sort of change, which I think is key based off of what Zuko said earlier when the kids are sort of more open-minded. Might just take some of the older people a little bit more time to adjust here. But no, I thought this was a good sort of setup to understanding that there's not everyone in the academy, even the staff, are 100% sort of on board with what Zuko wants to do in this sort of future here. But Zuko, again, is standing his ground. He's very sort of clear on what he sort of wants for the academy sort of going forward. So, that's really good to see him continue that.
Yeah, it's interesting getting this book after Mystery of Tension Island with the kind of same themes of like people trying to keep the past of the Fire Nation alive, and it kind of being present here. In this scene, she's a little bit more subtle about her kind of like rebellion, quote unquote, here, just kind of saying coddle as like the word of focus here, but not being actively we're going against this type thing. But Zuko can see through it, so this is why he's suspicious. But anyway, we continue on to the next page. So why is Liwa scared? What's there to be scared of? The other students, there's some that are so much bigger than us, and I don't think they want us here. And they look over at some of the, I guess, more noble kids because they're wearing the kind of old school uniform. See, look, they look really mean. And Ki just marches in full confidence. My big brother made it so that all Fire Nation girls could come to the Royal Fire Academy if they wanted to. If other students don't like that, that's their problem. And Liwa points out that, like, you're the Fire Lord's sister. They're not going to mess with you. But what about me? Like, I'm just like a commoner, basically. And Ki grabs her around the shoulder and is like, I'll protect you. I'll kick all their butts if they're mean to you. Thanks, Ki. So we're really establishing, and I think we got this from Smoke and Shadow and bits of the Search, that Ki is this kind of confident kind of girl who just, goes with it here and is just very confident in speaking out loud here. It's quite interesting, as we'll kind of get to in the upcoming scene. But I like this overall here because given how worried Ursa is about this, it's so interesting that like Ki is not at all worried. She's like, let's see what happens here. This looks like it could be fun. Whereas Liwa more represents the, like, I know I'm a kind of commoner here coming in. I've heard some things. Is this going to be okay? But she has someone to protect her is sort of the idea. So pretty nice stuff here. But what are your thoughts on this quick scene?
Yeah, no, I think, Key is just, I don't know, she's a fun character, a young character that has sort of the confidence and innocence of just sort of being able to sort of do anything and go anywhere. And she also has the backing of the current Fire Lord too as her sort of half brother. So that's sort of all works out for her to have even more confidence than maybe she ought to have. But it's cool to see. It's fun to see her here. It definitely is a really sort of stark contrast between her and her mom. But that's sort of typical of parents having sort of the years and the experience to sort of worry about things and just worry in general about their kids. So no, I like that. It's a really good sort of contrast there. That's I don't know, that feels pretty sort of realistic for a lot of kids sometimes.
Hmm. Then we go into the first teaching scene. So one of the teachers here, the teacher for Key and Co comes in and they're kind of having a history lesson. She introduces herself like, oh, there's some new faces here. I've been at the academy for a few years. Our history curriculum is going to be different this year due to Fire Lord Zuko changing things. And so she quotes directly from the book, long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony. Then everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. And she's like, oh dear, this book uses some very accusatory language when discussing the Fire Nation's role in the 100-Year War. And Key immediately jumps in and is like, it's true, the Fire Nation put colonies in the Earth Kingdom. The old Avatar, the one before Aang, tried to stop Sozin from doing it. Oh, and the old Avatar was my great-great-grandfather, so I know all about him. And it's just, this is a hilarious scene, but it's also like a perfect way to kind of show Key's confidence and that, like, it's I suppose the idea that she gets it, like she already knows some of this going in because she's close to kind of the people making the decisions, but she is also related directly to some of these people as well. This is the truth. And so the teacher's like, yes, you're right, Fire Lord Sozin did some very awful things, but that was so long ago, it's not something the Fire Nation would do now. And as we kind of continue to go through this scene, we kind of get this idea of just the teacher kind of being unwilling to just kind of be like, yeah, the Fire Nation was really bad during the war overall. Always wanting to be like, why is it so mean to us? We didn't do anything that bad. But Key just pushing the point home further that, like, we were the bad guy in the war. And my brother and also the Avatar, like, they helped to end the war. So like there is this stuff that's like just recent history overall. And then she starts reading out the book again, I guess, aware that this is the new curriculum, she has to do it. I do like Smug Key here quite a lot, that she's just fully on board for this, but that she is confident, maybe a bit bordering on overconfident, which is an interesting kind of trait to kind of give her here. But what are your thoughts on this? The teacher here struggling with the truth of the history book.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. That feels kind of sort of realistic, especially since, this is very sort of a quick turnaround change, right? Like, this is a pretty, like, it's not like sort of, what they might have done before when they sort of, started sort of attacking the sort of other nations and stuff like that. Like, I'm sure that wasn't sort of necessarily like a quick change, a quick sort of 180 in sort of, the history books and stuff like that. So, like, anybody who's of age, can pretty much remember exactly what happened, just the other year, 2, 3 ago, throughout the original sort of series, right? So, like, I don't know, for very recent history to change that way that quickly, I would be surprised if there wasn't, some, sort of resistance on things. But, Kiki being sort of herself and her sort of character is very sort of in your face about things, which again just feels like something a little kid would say, that sort of has the confidence to sort of say things and has some sort of backing, either rightly so or wrongly so. They might not even know how to be a bit more sort of tactful in their sort of approach about things, which is sometimes why it's fun to sort of see what kids will do in certain situations here. But yeah, I mean, she is sort of directly related to everything there, and can't really dispute that in any sort of way here. So I don't know. I think it's a fun way to sort of start this up, and especially with the line of how things go from the original series and everything like that. So that's always a nice thing to sort of see them sort of integrate here directly into the sort of story here. But yeah, I think this feels like a very sort of real thing to see sort of history change right before your eyes, and younger people being a little bit more accepting of it, and the sort of older ones that are trying to teach it be a little bit harder to get around it here. So it definitely does feel like it is a bit sort of accusatory, but that is at least from what we know, and at least the story so far, that is pretty true of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's an interesting one because of course we have a scene from like the show of like showing that Fire Nation history books are wrong from like the headband, when it comes to like portraying the air nomads completely wrong. So it's sort of like they more frame this with the idea of like, this is the harsh truth of the Fire Nation in the war versus like, but you lied about like the other nations in the war like previously. Like this is the truth overall, and this is going to be sort of the more maybe more normal change type stuff that's going to have to happen here. Is just like the parents accepting that this is the way that things are over time, changing it through the kids now learning the actual truth, that sort of thing. Do you have any thoughts about them using Katara's opening monologue here as the actual like text from the history book? It's an interesting one because like I can see some people maybe thinking as like it's a little bit like on the nose. Is it too much of a reference, or are we kind of almost retroactively saying that like this is Katara like reading out the history of the world, and this is also maybe showing when it was first written down into history, which is maybe a fun reference to add to Katara's opening narration. But any thoughts on that?
I don't know. I mean, I thought it was neat that they sort of included it. I didn't think, necessarily it had anything to do with Katara sort of like directly in terms of like her sort of opening line and stuff like that. But I don't know. I thought it was an okay sort of callback there. I could definitely feel how for some people it could be a little bit sort of like on the nose in terms of how they're going to start it. I mean, I don't. It feels like it's more, it's a bit more sort of story wise than necessarily like a history book way of sort of going things, because it is sort of like directly sort of stating an opinion, which, all books have their own sort of bias and stuff like that. So no book would be without that sort of thing. But, it does feel like it's more story wise and more historical sort of recording of things. But I don't know, maybe that's just because it's geared towards, the younger year students versus sort of the older year students. You could sort of frame it in that sort of regard there. But, that's not something that they would necessarily like break down in a comic or anything like that. Like that's too in the weeds about things here. But I don't know. I think for me, it worked well enough. It doesn't sort of, overstay its welcome. There's not much other else that's sort of, mentioning sort of the opening narration of the show and stuff like that. I think if they did more of that, then it probably would be a bit too much for me personally. But I think just for that sort of one little bit there, 2 times that it comes up, it's okay with me.
Yeah, I think with that opening narration, it's very easy to imagine a situation where it is too much of a reference. But I think it is nicely used here in the context of this scene, and that like, that's fun, it's that line. But that line is also actually the perfect way to sort of frame the opening of the war overall. And that, yeah, things were okay, and then this broke the peace. It was the Fire Nation who broke the peace. That is the truth that the Fire Nation kind of haven't accepted. So it is actually kind of cool. So we cut then to everyone outside playing, and we're back to the kind of jungle gym area. Ki and Liwa are trying to climb up, and then we have some of the kind of noble kids on top. They decide they're not letting them up, mainly that they're not letting Liwa up because they know she is a commoner. They're willing to let Ki up because she's a Fire Nation princess and question her for hanging out with a peasant. So immediately you can see, okay, this is how things used to be in the past, and this is something we also need to kind of deal with here. And you can see it in the sense of like, here's the classic uniform versus here's the more normal uniform that we have now. So what happens is that the girl firebends and Liwa gets knocked down. Ki gets very annoyed, firebends up and knocks that girl down. She then follows her down with like a fire punch, and we don't really find out what exactly happened. But I'm guessing the idea is that she didn't actually properly like injure the girl, but she just did enough to stand up for her friend here. So showing that Ki, who we of course learned right at the end of Smoke and Shadow was a firebender, is decently skilled kind of already. But we do also have to note that Ursa does note that she still needs to learn how to, I guess, control it properly. Like she maybe could have gone a bit overboard here, but it's a nice scene to just showcase that it's a powerful bloodline, so it makes sense that Ki does have the potential to be a very strong bender here. Again, some people with their portrayal of their opinions on Key are just so negative about everything she does, trying to portray it as like she's being presented as the ultimate bender ever, and I'm just like, this is a very normal portrayal of firebending here. I don't think there's anything out of the blue here that doesn't fit with her lineage at all. So, I think this is a perfectly fine scene, and we'll get to the result, the punishment, in just a second. But what are your thoughts on this fight in the schoolyard?
Yeah, the sort of classic fight in the schoolyard here. I mean, I think for showing the sort of difference in sort of like the sort of upper class, sort of higher class students versus the lower class students is, definitely gives you the idea that this was how things was. And I don't know, these students definitely feel like they're noble, but they also feel like they're sort of older as well. So they're sort of, more entrenched in the ways that the academy has been doing things for, the past. And that sort of is something that the younger kids seem to have, adjusted to pretty quickly here. And, even make a note of like Key, like I'm sure they could have given her sort of like the upper crust sort of uniform if they really sort of wanted to, but for whatever reason they sort of chose her to have sort of, I guess you could say, sort of the commoner school outfit, which definitely puts her at odds here. But they do make note of her being sort of the princess, or part of the royal family, so she could be with them if they wanted to. So I don't know, I think it was a good way to sort of show the contrasting of how things used to be versus how things are now here. And I don't know, the fight itself, it doesn't really feel like you're saying that it's anything sort of, too crazy. Like, I would be surprised if they had like a real sort of Agni Kai between the two of them, if Kiki would win, unless she's just, automatically that sort of good, or just has that much sort of overwhelming power here. We don't really see sort of the end of the fight here, so we don't really know, who won or anything like that. It doesn't seem like Kiki's at least too beat up after the fact there, so maybe she won, or maybe the other one was just already sort of taken down when they sort of fell off the apparatus here. So I don't know. I don't know if I necessarily see her as being, an amazing sort of prodigy sort of bender. I mean, the strength wise, it makes sense, like you're saying, from the lineage, but I don't know, until we see some real sort of, bending sort of forms like we got to see when, Azula in the show, when she was really good at a young age. Then I would probably be more of those sort of opinions in terms of her sort of skill and her prodigy sort of abilities.
Yeah, I think most of why people say that is, of course, when we first saw her bend, she burned through a metal door to free the kids in Smoke and Shadow. And because other times it's been portrayed as difficult for firebenders to bend through doors and stuff like that, and it's just like, I think it's, again, people kind of just overreading, reading too much into some of this stuff. Like, she seems like a character who is on her way to be a pretty good bender. The exact extent of that, I'm not sure, because I think a lot of people are very eager to really heavily put Key in the position of like, she's the Azula replacement, and that like really view her in that way, that like add this kind of sense of like malice almost to the writers, of like they added this character into the story just to replace Azula, which I think is a bit crazy, given that like, even though Azula doesn't really appear in the book here, I'd almost say like Azula has a bigger role in this comic than Key does. So I really struggle with this idea that like she's just a replacement. Like, sure, it's Ursa having another daughter, it's Zuko having another sister, and they're doing a little bit of a compare and contrast, but like, it's definitely not a replacement thing, because, as we'll get to in this book, Key is interested in Azula, and that's a super interesting dynamic of just the two sisters that we really haven't seen interact up to now, and how they would actually get on outside of some of the crazy situations that kind of we've kind of experienced up to now. I suppose, like, while we're here on that, like what are your thoughts on that? The relatively common complaint you sometimes see in the fandom of just really negative towards Key in relation to she's the Azula replacement.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, she's young and she's sort of like, as of now, she seems like she could potentially be sort of the better version, but Azula hasn't necessarily gone away, or at least as far as we know. Like she's still, an important character to the series and has a role that, hopefully is going to come back in some sort of form or fashion. So I don't know. I mean, I can see the idea, they're two daughters from the same mother and sort of one has a very sort of different outlook than the other here. But, they've been brought up in completely sort of different sort of, situations that it's almost not necessarily fair to compare them in that sort of way in my mind because he has no sort of understanding of sort of the royal lifestyle or the pressures or any of that sort of aspect that Zuko and Azula sort of grew up with, and the sort of expectations that were sort of brought upon them, which caused Zuko to go completely on his own and do things and try to figure out his own way. She doesn't really have that. Like she's, I don't know, Key's very sort of innocent in that sort of way in terms of how she interacts with the world and how she's sort of so out there and so sort of forceful with things. Like she's not, she doesn't really have that sort of edge, which as far as we can tell, is something that was sort of garnered from sort of Ozai and stuff like that. So I don't know. I can see the sort of base level sort of comparisons, their skills and stuff like that, or perceived skills, because we still don't really know how good Key actually sort of is here. But, I don't know, Key definitely feels like she's, I don't know, she's sort of, I can see how she would fit in sort of with the crew if she was of like a better age, older character, but she's not really there yet to really sort of, replace her in that sort of way. Like, she doesn't seem like she's going to be joining them in any sort of like adventures or anything like that. Like there's a bit too much of a age gap there. Maybe when she's older, maybe, I don't know, that could be something. And if she's in sort of like future, media, the movies and stuff like that, that would be really curious to see how she's sort of portrayed in that sort of way. But right now, I don't really necessarily fair to sort of see her as a direct replacement yet. I don't know. Maybe they will try to do something later on, but I don't think we're there yet, at least.
Like I get it. Like Azula does literally have a line in The Search where she kind of effectively alludes to that kind of idea. But from Azula's point of view, that does make sense, especially when she hears about Key for the first time. But they have sort of prevented them from overly interacting with each other since then, which is kind of interesting. But like you say, they're purposeful with the whole idea of like, well, here's how a daughter would turn out without Ozai in the picture. And again, it's that whole idea of Ozai has to linger over like every avenue of this family when you talk about it. And that's a huge thing that Key did not have Ozai as her father. She had Noren Ikem as her father. And that's a very, very different situation. And because Ozai was not involved in her upbringing, it meant that like Ursa as Noriko was a very different mother as well. So yeah, it is a different situation, but like it's not a replacement. This is not like, again, the writers really being like, here's the good Azula type thing, because she is just a different character overall. There might be some traits in the sense that you can tell they're both confident and skilled characters to a certain degree, but also at the same time, Key is still so young, like she's still kind of like figuring herself out overall type thing. Because, like, let's not forget back in, like, Smoke and Shadow, she still had that arc where she was very kind of, like, cold around Ursa because Ursa was so scared being back in the Fire Nation. And that was, like, a very kind of young character arc. And that sort of thing. But we'll cut to the punishment here. So they're in Shihan's office, and the big question here is going to be, like, okay, what's going to happen here? And it's only Key and Liwa in the office. Shihan says she's disappointed in both of them. Key tries to point out that the other girl started it, and points out that, hey, the academy is meant to be for all kids, not just noble families. She points out that, noble girls shouldn't be calling Liwa names. Shihan responds that, those girls come from some of the Fire Nation's finest families. Their lineages go back generations. And Key is just like, so what? They started the fight. And Shihan just doesn't believe that young women from such families would do something like that. I heard from the other students that it was Liwa who started the fight. And Key is infuriated at this, of course. Lewa's not really saying anything because she's of course been scared this whole time through. She's almost, I guess, thinks that Key might get her into trouble here with what's happening here. And as we see in the next page, Lewa is the one who gets punishment. Not even Key, who actually, I suppose, then got involved in a fight and finished it. And she's just really furious about this whole situation. And Chian says, I hope you and Lewa will learn from this. Listen to your betters. And Key just says, what does that mean? I think you know exactly what it means. And Key storms out. She's awful. The school isn't meant to be like this. Lewa is very much like, I knew this was kind of going to happen. I'm going to tell my mom what happened here. I knew this was a mistake. And it's affected the dynamic a little bit because Lewa's like, please don't get me into more trouble. But the grin comes on Key's face at this point, and she just says, no, it's the headmistress who's going to get into trouble. She's going to regret messing with a Fire Nation princess. With the idea being that I guess she's going to bring this to Zuko to set up basically the next scene here of like, hey, this is not the way this was meant to be. Zuko is very passionate about changing things. He's going to fix this overall because this is the old school treatment here where it all depends on what your family is more than anything else. So an interesting scene, definitely, because they I think could have taken this in a slightly different direction, where I think I might have said this when we discussed the preview pages, that they might have taken this in the direction more referencing the back of the book, where it kind of teases the idea of like, will Key go down the same route that Azula did? And what if Shihan praised Key for her performance in the fight of like dealing with someone who went against her, and Key was suddenly almost put into the position of like the new hope for the academy because of how talented and confident and skilled that she is. They don't go for that because they ultimately, I think, realize quite early on they're not really going to have Key attempt to turn out like Azula, because the academy is changing and May is going to be there to prevent any of that. But this is a nice way to do that, given that you're not really trying to overly change Key as a character. But what are your thoughts on this and how Shihan handles this situation?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, this fits in the mode of how, what I feel Key would do in terms of like supporting her friend and sort of, from her perspective, seeing, or at least what she's sort of learned so far, seeing the sort of injustice brought upon her sort of friend here. So no, I think this, it's just more along the lines of them sort of, showing what the academy used to be and sort of, trying to get Key to sort of change her sort of mind on things. But she understands, at least to whatever degree, of how the academy is supposed to be, at least from Zuko's perspective going forward here. So I like that she's also able to sort of stand her ground. She has that sort of confidence, in order to know sort of that there's something that, she could do, at least in terms of, this sort of wrong that's been happening to her friend. Because it is interesting that she gets away without having any sort of issues, right? Like, you would think that like she would get some sort of punishment for at least being involved in the situation, but I guess because of her her station of being a Fire Nation princess in this instance is sort of allowing her to sort of get away with things, which is interesting. You would think that they might do something to her for this sort of situation here, but I guess from the rumors and everything like that, they're trying to sort of keep her out of this, at least in terms of the punishments here. But no, I think this was definitely something to see, more inflections on sort of what the academy used to be and what sort of needs to be changed.
Mm-hmm. So the very next day, Zuko appears in Shihan's office and immediately addresses this. So we get the kind of confirmation, Key told him about what happened, and he's immediately here to address this. The disturbing stories he's heard about discipline methods at the school, that you're harsh towards children of ordinary Fire Nation citizens and lenient towards noble-born children. Is this what's happening here? She basically defends this by basically being like, we have to kind of do things the way the upper crust of the society wants. They're the most influential citizens, that like you're their Fire Lord, so you have to make sure you keep the respect of these people. Like, shouldn't you be thinking about this, to have support from them? Because they support me, they support the academy and the way it kind of has typically operated. And Zuko's just like, I'm bringing in a new teacher. Who? And this is where he introduces, it's a graduate of the academy. Maybe you remember her, Governor Ukano's daughter, May. I think she'll be a good addition to this school. And Shihan, he kind of gets her here because she's like, oh yeah, Governor Ukano's daughter, yes. Not the most motivated student, but definitely from the right family. I'd be happy to take her under my wing as a new teacher. And Zuko just walks out with the biggest grin on his face, being like, I'm sure she'll be thrilled to return to the academy. Because I guess in this case, he knows he hasn't told May yet. So there's that. He's waiting for the big reveal. But also, he knows May better than most people. So Shihan doesn't know what she's in for, basically, coming up next when May actually arrives here. Because Shihan's kind of expecting old school May who doesn't talk much, rather than May who is expressing herself a little bit more. So it's a really fun scene here, just because Zuko knows May so well. But again, another example of him as a leader handling things so well, like the growth from, say, the promise to now, huge for Zuko. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
I think Zuko does a good job here. I like his sort of, I don't know, maybe it's like quiet confidence or whatever, in terms of handling this situation that's come about here. He doesn't really sort of, go overboard on the situation or like that. He just tries to get sort of a clearer picture about things. And, the headmistress here, she tries to sort of, talk her way in terms of, how things should be at the academy, from at least from her perspective here. And Zuko, he doesn't really sort of argue with it at all, unless he just, says what he's going to do, which I guess, as the Fire Lord, he has that sort of prerogative in order to sort of, change things in this regard here. I mean, I guess he could, be really sort of extreme in the situation if he really sort of wanted to, but, he doesn't feel like he has to do that at this sort of time here. He doesn't even really get like a full account on the situation, which I think is good. Like, he shouldn't necessarily be involved with like the day-to-day things, but this is like his big thing, that getting the school, getting the new generation up to sort of, the perspectives that he thinks the Fire Nation should be. So I don't know. I think it's cool that he has this perspective. He's bringing in a new teacher that, at least from the headmistress here, she thinks that this will be sort of like something that she can sort of influence here. But yeah, like you're saying, like, she doesn't really know the current Mai compared to how she was, many years ago.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we cut to the page and it's immediately like, you want me to what? And her mother behind her is like, he wants you to teach the first year students at the Royal Fire Academy. How wonderful. And he says, you were the first person I thought of, May. Sure, when thinking of someone to wrangle the Fire Nation's brattiest kids, let's pick the girl who hates people. And Michi is like, oh May, you don't hate people, you care deeply for them. Mother, have you met me? That's just an act. I know you have a sensitive heart underneath all that. And Zuko points out, you're great with Tom Tom. He's my brother. I have to be nice to him. And we get this line, considering how my sister treated me, I don't think being related to someone is any guarantee you'll be kind to them. True. But there's another reason I need you to teach at the school. I need an ally at the academy, May. I'm trying to change the Fire Nation from the ground up, and that starts with what the kids are being taught in school, unfortunately. Let me guess, it's not going so hot. I need someone to keep an eye on the academy headmistress and make sure she's actually following the changes. I don't trust her, but you trust me. And he just says, you don't want kids to go through what you went through at the old academy. You know what that place was like. Yeah, I remember. But the headmistress will know you put me there to watch her, so she'll be on guard. She knows who you are, and she's open to taking you under her wing. She knows who I am. What did you do, Zuko? And so the unfortunate reveal has to come out here that he convinced Shihan of this by highlighting the family that she's from. And she's like annoyed about this. So I'm acceptable to this woman because you told her I'm from the right family. It's all I could think of in the moment. So this is a nice scene because, of course, it's May's book. So this is her debut scene, but it's also the first time we see May and Zuko interact since Smoke and Shadow. And everyone, the second this book was announced, was like, is there going to be progress in the Meizuko relationship? What's happening on that front? And you can see straight away that there has been evolution since Smoke and Shadow. Things are not as drama kind of focused, I suppose, as they maybe were back then. You can tell they're a lot more comfortable around each other now that more time has passed. But not that much time. Like, all the comics are actually pretty close together when you kind of reflect back on it here. But there's some nice stuff here straight away that, you know, her gloomy girl act is a bit of an act. It is part of who she is, but she does actually have strong feelings underneath all of that. That's the big point that they're kind of getting across here. And I think there is just some nice kind of stuff overall here, where immediately you do get introduced to the idea that May just doesn't like a lot of these Fire Nation old school kind of tradition stuff of like, I hate being treated differently because I'm a noble family, from a noble family. So you can tell she's kind of on board with this kind of straight away. She is kind of invested in making some changes. It's just, this is going to be a bit of a nuisance. She doesn't know if this is for her or not, but we'll get into that in the next bit of the scene. But what are your thoughts on this, the introduction of May into...
Yeah, I thought this was a good way of sort of bring her back into the fold of things and showing their sort of dynamic here, Zuko and May, sort of, we've been wondering sort of how they would interact with each other. Would it be sort of super awkward, or would it be sort of okay, or anything like that? I think, the book overall does a good job of, showing them interacting, especially later on when they do have a bit of a conflict later on. But even here with the sort of initial sort of, re-get together here, I think it's really good to see sort of, more her personality, her mom there sort of, saying what she sort of really feels underneath things. So, we can see that Mai has sort of loosened up, I guess, you could say a little bit here over time. She still has sort of the same sort of, gloomy sort of semi-caustic sort of personality here, but it's sort of not quite sort of as edge as we've sort of seen in the past. So I like this. I think this was a good development of her character overall, at least in these initial parts here of her sort of, being explained something that she can potentially do.
Mm-hmm. And we immediately addressed that kind of point of Michi, kind of her mother saying that, no, I think you would make a wonderful teacher. He is right. You are really good with Tom Tom. It would be good for you to find something new to do, because it's cool that you're here at the flower shop, but you do need something else to do to blossom effectively as a flower into the you're meant to be type thing. And she's just like, okay, sure, blossom, fine. I can't believe I'm agreeing to this. I hated that place, Zuko. And he just points out, at least Azula won't be there this time. And we'll cut to the next day, her first day on the job, in just a second. I like this a lot, because I like that Michi is actually used quite effectively just over these few panels to just be there in terms of like, I know the real you, just say what you actually feel, like lower the act a little bit here. This would be good for you. And the fact that, even though they maybe don't go into it a lot, the fact that Zuko does choose her, because I think he knows that she has some of these feelings about these things, that like, you will be someone who, will stand up for yourself about this stuff if it's being done the old way. He knows her that much, that this might be something that actually she is actually quite good at. It's nice to see, because this is the book actually kind of highlighting what it's about here, why it's a May focused book, is that, was she just going to be stuck in the flower shop until maybe she and Zuko got back together? No, they're actually giving her her own path as a character here. And we're about to see that actually the teaching position really suits her, especially this kind of new kind of evolving version of her that we're kind of getting to meet here. We saw bits and pieces of in Smoke and Shadow. It's pretty exciting, because I really like May as a character, and I think this is really, really well written. But what are your thoughts on this final page of this?
Yeah, no, I think this is, I like that she's getting her own path, like you're saying there. Like she's going to have a larger role in sort of the Fire Nation, which, makes it seem, if they ever do, sort of the proper, sort of get back together relationship, like there'll be a reason for her to be sort of in the midst of things here, right? Like she's not just going to be sort of in this sort of side place with Michi, her mom, doing this flower shop, which, is cool and is important, but it's not really sort of the thing that you would particularly, have in mind for our sort of like main characters, right? So I think this is a great way for her to have sort of her own, like you're saying, her own sort of path and career to some sort of, notoriety, and who knows where this might take her, in the future of things.
Hmm. So then we cut to the next day. She's in her teacher outfit. She enters the academy and she says, I survived this place once, I'll do it again. And immediately we go into a little bit of a flashback. She remembers, I suppose, her own first day at the academy, saying kind of goodbye at the gates to her mother and her father. Michi says, your first day at the Royal Fire Academy, where did my little girl go? I'm right here, Mom. Ukano says, daughter, I have something important to tell you. You're not going to cry too, are you? The Royal Fire Academy is a place of incredible importance. The Fire Nation's best and brightest attend this school, and the friendships you make here will help you get ahead in life. So already that wording is a little bit like, make sure you find the right kind of friends here. Get to know those girls from good families who can advance your career after you graduate. There's someone you'll want to be friends with. As Azula walks by with a bit of an entourage behind her, which almost like you can definitely miss this. Ty Lee is part of that entourage. They never highlight her in the flashback, but she is actually right there in a few of these. But yeah, as Azula walks by with her entourage, the Fire Lord's granddaughter. I heard she's a remarkable firebending prodigy. Making friends with her would be so helpful for you, May. And that's the core of this kind of initial scene here. This is really, really cool here because this shows that the writer really knows what they're doing when it comes to these other characters that, like, May's parents are characters. We know Michi from some of the more recent comics, but we know Ukano as well from those comics. And yeah, he's the career guy. This was the whole point in a way of why May was so always struggled to express herself, because it was always about his career, including her going to the academy. It's, as he says, he slips up, to advance my career. Which I guess does help in the end, the fact that May does form a friendship with Azula. So interesting. But again, it's like, it's not friendship for the sake of friendship. It's friendships that will get you somewhere. And they'll add on to this as we go through about the Academy's exact approach when it comes to friends and handling this sort of thing. But it just speaks to the idea of even elements of our own family represent things the Fire Nation need to move away from in this new era. But what are your thoughts on May's the start of her first day and remembering her old first day on the at the academy?
Yeah, no, I thought this was cool. I think, whenever we get these sort of flashback scenes, it's really interesting because you definitely get a different side of May before she sort of, became even more sort of gloomy in this. But you can already see it sort of here, like her sort of, talk back to her sort of mom here. Like she's so sort of like, straightforward to the point here. But you can see that she, I don't know, it feels like she's already sort of questioning things in the way that, sort of her father wants her to do things, which seems a complete sort of contrast to sort of what we, sort of gather from Azula and her sort of personality already at sort of the academy here. So it's definitely something to see, getting to see the younger version of our characters here and how that sort of reflects back on them. And yeah, it is funny that we do see Ty Lee in a bunch of these scenes, but they really don't mention. I think it's pretty clear who it is, especially with her being so sort of like positive compared to most of the other characters here. But I don't know, it's definitely something to see, especially with her being in sort of like the official sort of outfit here. Is definitely, something you wouldn't necessarily see for her.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think the expectations for flashback with these characters is that they were going to maybe show the origin of the trio, and they don't quite do that because it's very May and Azula focused, with the idea, I guess, being that the May Ty Lee friendship kind of happened in the background at some point. Whereas it's maybe the one bit thing that feels like a little bit of a missed opportunity with the book is just like, yeah, why didn't they do the Ty Lee bit? But are they saying that actually like Ty Lee maybe only became a proper part of the trio a little bit later on, and she was just kind of one of the rest of the group for a while? I'm not really sure, but it leaves it open for like a little bit more of a backstory bit to kind of handle here. Because I know some people wish that they had focused a bit more on sort of the friendship of that trio, when the book ultimately is trying to go down more of the point of these friendships formed for the sake of the noble family and advancing your positions, rather than just showing the personal dynamics between Mei Azula and Ty Lee. And it's just a case of focus of the book as such. And in this case, it's more focused on Mei and Azula, which is maybe the more kind of fractious element of that, because Mei and Ty Lee are like best friends, and clearly Ty Lee, at the very least, has a huge she admires Azula like a lot. We'll get a little bit on the Mei Azula dynamic, but it's a little bit more cold, I suppose, as we'll see, which is kind of interesting. But we'll go on. So yeah, Azula walks by some other girls, and one of them is holding like I guess it's a platypus bear type kind of teddy. She's like, "Give me that." "Why? It's mine." "When your princess tells you to do something, you do it. You don't ask why." So the girl hands it over, and immediately Azula burns it, just incinerates it with her firebending, which is not blue yet, which is interesting. And the question is, why did you do that? I didn't like how it looked at me. And we cut to Ukano basically being like, making friends with her could be so helpful for you, Mei. And Mei's just like, really? You want me to make friends with her after what I've just seen? And then there's a nice transition from the kind of worried Mei to the very determined Mei of the present, highlighting a little bit of that kind of character development. But yeah, this scene is very classic Azula. Like this is basically a reference to like a scene from the show where she burns the doll that Iroh sent her, that sort of thing. This is exactly the sort of thing that she does. And of course, they basically highlight that she's like the queen bee of the academy immediately. She's young, she's this prodigy, but she's everything the academy wants. So she is the dominant force at the academy. No one's telling her to do anything differently, so no one stands up to her. So this is just Azula unleashed effectively in a place that is not going to tell her that she's wrong. So that's why we are very much seeing the worst elements of Azula presented in this kind of a backstory here, because we're not trying to be overly sympathetic about this specific portrayal of her. It's pretty accurate in my mind to a lot of the younger Azula presentation as well. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I would agree. This is, from everything that we've seen before from the show and stuff and other sort of media, I think this is pretty one-to-one with sort of young Azula, and it definitely feels like the Academy overall didn't sort of, I guess you could say, help deter this in any sort of regard. This, seems like this was how the Academy operated, which is, concerning, how Ozai sort of has already, at least we're assuming he's already sort of influenced her up until this point, seems sort of like on par with, current Fire Nation sort of, tendencies at that point in time here. So, yeah, no, this definitely feels like this is sort of on point, and it definitely feels like it's something that even Mai was sort of curious about sort of going along with back in the day here. But, she was sort of supposed to be, the good daughter and sort of get in with the good crowd here. So this is sort of the start of her sort of following along with that sort of process.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Mei heads in, and she just notes that Azula's not here anymore. Be grateful for that. I assume Zuko told you I was coming. She walks into Shihan's office. Shihan says, "I remember you from your days at the Academy, and now you've returned to join me in guiding the Fire Nation's new..." And Mei looks at the portrait in the background. It's of Headmistress Pearl, and she notes, she isn't still teaching, is she? She's got to be at least 100 years old by now. No, retired, but I like having her portrait close by. She left me some of the honors she received from Fire Lords Ozai and Sozin as a reminder to uphold the majesty of the Fire Nation's long history. And Mei immediately is like, the less we uphold from the Ozai and Sozin's reigns, the better the Fire Nation will be. Shihan responds that Fire Nation history is important, but the reply is, that's why I'm here, to make sure these kids are learning exactly what happened during the 100-Year War. And immediately these two don't quite get on. They have very different approaches here and want to do different things. And it's a pretty nice start here because obviously Headmistress Pearl, they are being, I think, somewhat serious when they say that she basically is like 100 years old, because for her to have received an award from Sozin, it has to kind of go back like basically
Yeah.
that far. We pointed this out in like the previews and stuff like that, but like it is kind of a little bit weird they don't mention a Zulon. It's not like a continuity error or something like that, but it's weird because the timing would work out in a way where she would have to have like basically gotten an award from Sozin like the first few years she was maybe a teacher or high up at the academy. And then most of her life, as in like 70, 80 years, the Fire Lord she would be under would be a Zulon. And there's relatively few years under Ozai. So it's weird that like it's awards from the two Ozais that are not most of her lifespan. But I don't know. I guess they're highlighting both ends of the era, and Azulon misses out here just because he's the middle one, even though he's most of that time. It's just a bit of a fun one anyway. But that's the initial introduction of those two. What are your thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can pretty clearly see there's going to be some conflict there, and that the current headmistress, even if she is, I guess a bit sort of younger, it's definitely sort of, at least currently, sort of, entrenched with the history and not necessarily for sort of the right sort of way. Definitely feels like she's part of the sort of old crowd in terms of, what was, what made sort of the Fire Nation the greatest, like having sort of, the ships that they used to sort of destroy everything seems like an interesting thing to sort of keep there to sort of show, at least from the perspective of being sort of a proud for it for those particular reasons. Some of the other items, maybe they make sort of more sort of sense. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting to see them sort of come to a head here right in the beginning here.
Mm-hmm. So then May walks into her class. Outside, she's like, they're just like Tom Tom, only they outnumber you 20-1. You got this. She walks in. Key is the first one to give comment to Liwa. That's my brother's ex-girlfriend. Haha, weird. I know, right? Who'd want to date Zuko? And she gets her sort of, hey, Zuko here moment. Hi, kids, I'm May, your teacher. And she has the goofiest grin on her face ever. So she is super nervous kind of going into this. But as we kind of settle down into it, she's like, oh, I'm going to be teaching you stuff. Yeah, and she looks at books. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a bug lands on Key, and there's a bit of a freak out here. And May's like, hey, calm down. It's just a cicada beetle. It was probably flying around looking for a place to land, and it hitched a ride on your shoulder. And she immediately gets the attention of the class by handling this situation so calmly and like getting the bug onto her hand. And she gives a bit of a fact file lesson on this cicada beetle. They're amazing. They burrow underground for 18 years, then climb out of their nest and live in the outside world for only a week. Imagine spending your whole life underground in total darkness, never knowing there's a completely different world out there. And when you finally get to see that world, you only get a week to enjoy it. And she looks around at the books, she looks around at the outside and is like, hey, we're not going to sit in the class. We're going to go outside and catch bugs and kind of have fun during this lesson. That's the way I'm going to do it here, because the bugs clearly captured the attention of the kids, and she seems to know some stuff about that. Very interesting scene, because obviously from a kind of thematic, symbolic kind of point of view, the idea, I guess, is that this is her talking about herself. I think primarily, I think is the interpretation here that this represents, I suppose, her while she was at the academy and like her earlier life, being kind of like underground, like holding her kind of emotions in. And now it's a new world where she kind of gets to go out and enjoy it, express herself type thing. And it sort of represents, I suppose, the kids of the Fire Nation as well, of like, this is the old school thing, this is the new school thing. It's an interesting one, but it's a nice way to just in a couple of pages get across, like, here's how May gets past the initial awkwardness of not having a clue what to do as a teacher, and it ends up going very smoothly from here. But what are your thoughts on this initial introduction to her class?
Yeah, no, this is very fun. I think this is, pretty on point. Like, she doesn't necessarily have a lot of experience with teaching kids, right? So she decides to sort of fall back on what she sort of knows and, can explain with some sort of interest and an intrigue and, something that actually gets the kids interested in what they're sort of doing here. Because, just necessarily going straight to the books, isn't always sort of the best way to go about things. And, especially since this is something that she seems like you're saying she has, experience with. I think it's, play towards your strengths and stuff like that. Like, there's not a lot here that they say sort of explicitly, but you can see that, they're having a good time, having this sort of outdoor lesson, especially in this sort of environment in the Fire Nation, which, seems to almost have, really good sort of weather and stuff like that. So I thought this was a really good way to sort of get her over, the hump of, the awkward teacher phase in the beginning here. I think this worked out pretty well, and also does a good job of setting the stage of having some conflicts because this isn't probably necessarily the sort of typical lesson that you expect from such a high prestige academy.
hmm And yeah, we get a kind of montage page here where everyone's outside enjoying themselves. They're catching some bugs. It seems like Key and May immediately get on very well. They're kind of quite close. And Sheehan watches out the window and is furious. And so as we cut to the next page, May's bringing the kids back in. And Sheehan confronts her like, what were you doing outside with the children? And she's like, I was teaching them about the Beatles. But how will that enable these children to become leaders of the Fire Nation? And May's response is pretty perfect for her. Probably won't, but so what? They're kids. These children need discipline in their education. They need to be taught the art of war and politics, not the life cycle of bugs. And again, classic May response here. Actually, I don't think they do. And it's just immediately this huge contrast between these two. The Royal Fire Academy has a responsibility to instill Fire Nation pride and morals in our students. I remember teachers feeding me that nonsense when I was a student here too. And what did it get us? A generation of kids told it was our right to dominate the world and attack our neighbors if they didn't give us what we wanted. And in the end, we lost that war. So I'm going to teach these kids to love bugs, not war. That's the future of the Fire Nation that makes sense to me. And the kids overhear this, and it seems like they all see the little bit of fire here from May and kind of like appreciate this versus the very serious, kind of almost foreboding stuff that Sheehan is saying. But immediately you can see that you were maybe worried that like is May gonna maybe go back into her shell in such a kind of awkward situation for her, but actually because Sheehan is kind of pushing her so much, the more feisty part of her personality is kind of beginning to come out, that when she does express herself, like, oh boy, does she express herself type thing. So it's a really interesting to see more of this side of her, of just May kind of really dominating the scene here, completely aware of what she believes in and the way things should be done, even though she was so worried about the way she wanted to teach them, would it go well, but she's so confident about, actually, no, I'm really into this, and I think that's really cool how they got to that. But what are your thoughts on this confrontation?
Yeah, no, that is really neat to see her sort of speak her mind here. That's something that we've seen her character sort of develop over time, throughout the course of seeing her in the show and comics and stuff like that. So this definitely really feels like this is the peak of her sort of going against sort of the grain of whatever, someone's trying to put her in a situation that she really doesn't, sort of agree with. And I think it comes across pretty clear that, her perspective of the academy and everything that she's experienced was definitely not good. And she really wants to, she's on board with Zuko's sort of idea of teaching things or doing things a different way, considering the old way didn't necessarily work. Like she said there, they lost the war. They didn't, come out on top, which, maybe there was something that could have happened that they could have done better. But, this is sort of the result that they're at right now. And she's able to sort of, shape them in sort of a different way here. So no, I like that she's able to sort of deal with this conflict, without, resulting to anything sort of crazy or anything like that, but, something to sort of help her students, which she seems like she's really, involved with.
hmm Yeah, the we lost the war point is pretty important because it basically comes up again in a slightly different context, but it's the core of May's point in terms of like the academy, and that like if this is the ultimate tradition of the Fire Nation, is like teaching people to be this way, like where's the success stories? Like, we lost the war. Did Azula turn out to be the best leader ever? No. It's a really good point to just kind of highlight that this is the error of this style of doing things overall. And especially with May, where she's never been at all like the Fire Nation loyalist character. Like, sure, she was part of Azula's team and was kind of the one of the villains for a while, but she's never you never got her opinion on things. She was always the one who, I think one of the last episodes we reviewed was the drill. She literally doesn't participate in the fight there, so she's always been on the outside of things. Even in Smoke and Shadow, when like her father is involved in like almost creating a coup against Zuko, she doesn't agree with her father like at all. The only defense there is that she wants to kind of keep her family together, but ultimately she agrees with Zuko. So this is, even though we've never seen maybe that much of her opinion on the Fire Nation, I think it's clear she's never been like, oh yeah, this nation has all these traditions that are like the most important things in the world. So the fact that she kind of immediately latches onto the new approach kind of is fitting for the character, because she's never maybe been attached to the old ones, as we kind of see. So that's a kind of cool approach with the character, because she has always been portrayed as kind of so like sealed off. You've never known what her true opinions on certain things are. But we go into the next flashback next. So again, it's Ukano and May. Have you become friends with Azula yet? Basically, she sets things on fire for no reason. I'm not sure I want to be friends. His counter to this is powerful people can be intimidating. They won't allow anything to get in their way. That's how they become powerful people in the first place. You can either be powerful or be the obstacle that gets trampled by a powerful person. You don't want that, do you? No, Dad, I don't want to be trampled. So make friends with the princess. And literally pushes her straight back into the academy, and May kind of goes about her business and trying to become friends with Azula. And this kind of speaks to, again, the approach here is that it's a very like forced thing of like her opinion on Azula is that like initially, do I want to be friends with someone like that? And the reason that she ends up doing it is just that like she gets this warning from her father that like, well, if you don't, what if she comes after you one day and she tramples over you like she does to kind of other people? That it's better to be on that side than on the other side. And that's the main kind of point here. The idea of, I guess, May's logic is sort of like, you'll kind of get a free ride through the academy if you're behind Azula. So interesting there. But what are your thoughts on what Ukano says to her here?
Yeah, I mean, this is, definitely his sort of, idea of this is how you're going to get ahead in life, and this is why we're sending you to the academy, and this is my way to sort of move up in my sort of station here. So it definitely feels like we've been saying that she's not really about this even from sort of like a young age. Like, she can already tell that Azula is probably sort of bad business at this point here, but she's doing what she thinks she has to do for her family. So she she has that sort of aspect of her that she does care about her family as much as they care about her most of the time. Shows she's willing to go through this sort of process here. So I thought this was a good way to show her sort of already, like you've been saying, like she doesn't necessarily agree with the way that things are done even from a young age. Like, she doesn't want to sort of follow the mold, but at this point in her life, she's able to at least be influenced enough to actually sort of try to sort of do these things versus when she's older and she's just able to go completely against them. So it's a good way of showing her character from now to when she was younger.
Mm-hmm. So she walks over to Azula, who is giving a kind of speech basically to her little group here, which includes Ty Lee. She just says that I think I said to my father, Prince Ozai, I think he should focus on training spies to infiltrate the Earth Kingdom, not soldiers. And then Maze just walks up and be like, hey, I think we should be friends. Why should I be friends with you? And Maze just like, because I can do this. She whips out her knives and just like throws one like centimeters one side of Azula's face, centimeters on like the other side, basic. I guess the idea is Azula does have to slightly dodge them, but Azula only moves like just enough to dodge them, whereas the girl behind next to the tree is like full on getting out of the way as they hit the tree behind. And so she just throws these two knives, they hit the tree, and then she just stands there like, there we go. That's my bait. And Azula's just like, that's supposed to impress me? No, it's what I offer if you're friends with me. And Azula's like, okay, let's be friends then. Come on, time to have some fun. And she takes her off. I know a few people who need knives thrown at them. And you sort of see May with a more like, okay, I have to do this, I guess, kind of type expression. This is what I need to do to kind of not get trampled on. As, you know, we see the idea of like, this is somewhat representative of what the dynamic is going forward. Like, she is going to use May and Ty Lee for their skills as part of her kind of team going forward. Of course, there's a friendship there to a certain degree. It's not what this book focuses on necessarily, in that like it's the significance of the flashback is mostly just that here is the context surrounding how May and Azula kind of became friends. It's fascinating because I think May kind of, I suppose, hits the nail on the head in terms of, I can offer my skills to you. That's how I will gain her friendship, because kind of like Ozai, using people based on what skills they have as weapons is kind of part of the idea that they're going for there. So it's a pretty effective scene where it goes from like May is invisible to Azula to all of a sudden like, oh, this girl's kind of got something that I can use, which is interesting. But what are your thoughts on the moment they become friends?
Yeah, it's definitely more about like what you can do for me or what I can offer you in terms of the beginning of this friendship here, which, you know, it fits the mold of what the Academy seems to want to instill in their students, at least at this point in time, you know, in the Academy's history here, which is, you know, sort of what they're currently fighting against here. It's all about, you know, what can you do for me? What can I offer you? And how does that work, you know, towards our potentially, I guess you could say, mutual benefit. But here, I think you can definitely tell that it's all about sort of, you know, Azula, even from sort of a young age here, and sort of, you know, what she's going to get out of it. So I don't know. This feels like it's sort of on par for what we know of Azula and her personality, and, you know, I guess May and seeing her knives again, which is like really the only time that we see them in this comic here, which is interesting to see that she, you know, already had the skill to some degree at sort of a young age here. It doesn't say sort of how skilled she is at the knives, but, you know, we can see that that's been her sort of non-bender sort of skill that she sort of had developed even from sort of a young age here. So even the fact that she has them in the Academy at this point in time is interesting, considering, you know, the history of the Academy and the benders there and their sort of skills and their development over time, and how that was viewed in the Fire Nation at that point in time.
Mm-hmm. So we cut out of the flashback, and it is May talking to Ki and Liwa, basically. Ki asks her, how come you and my brother aren't still boyfriend and girlfriend? I think Zuko needs a girlfriend. I'm sure he does, but it's not going to be me. And Ki says, oh, why not? I think you're perfect for him. You helped him rescue me from those scary Kamurakage ladies. And May quickly says, Zuko and I are friends, but not boyfriend and girlfriend. No. And then, hey, want to help me test this? As she's setting up the kind of tightrope thing, basically. And she mentions, a friend of mine used to perform in a circus, and she gave me this. It's how she learned to walk a tightrope. I thought it'd be fun to give it a try. So it's a Ty Lee kind of reference here, as they kind of, she's giving them a bit of a low height tightrope here between some trees. But obviously the significance of this scene is that it's directly addressing the May and Zuko relationship. Ki does it this time. And it's an interesting one, because May obviously says, you know, it's not going to be me. But I think the timing is quite important in this as well, in terms of context. Like, this might come across quite negative towards the relationship, but at the same time, I'm like, this is a very tropey style scene for a couple that has been broken up, but you almost expect to get back together in the future. Of course, she changes the topic, like, immediately, and is not going to have a full discussion with, like, a 6-year-old about her kind of romantic relationship. But the fact that a scene like this is in the book is still kind of telling, I think, to a certain degree. That to a certain degree, some of the other characters within the comic are almost written to be shippers of the relationship, and they can see the chemistry there, even if maybe it's too close for them. Because a lot of people, like a lot of worried Mei and Zuko fans coming out of this book, oh, they didn't get back together, really freaking out that, is it over because they didn't confirm it? But I'm kind of like, there's some positives in this as well. I think they're just taking a very normal, kind of realistic approach to this, where they're not rushing them back together. They kind of want, I suppose, maybe whenever they do get them back together, for it to really be a big scene where you know they're not going to break up like again. And again, most of the comics are all set within the exact same year of each other. So even though it's been a long time in real life, it hasn't been that long IRL. Smoke and Shadow was still only like a few weeks, maybe a few months ago, if even that. That's kind of my thoughts on this, is just that, like, it's a very classical type scene for this sort of setup that I'd actually take a little bit of positive from, and there's more we'll get into later on with the relationship. But what are your thoughts on this scene here, the first very obvious direct romance relationship setup?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. This definitely felt like it was just a setup in order to get them to sort of ask the question, right? Like, because, like you said, no one, whenever a younger kid asks this sort of question, they're always like, trying to sort of, really like literally just like ship them together with someone that they think will work well with them. And, they know that they have had a relationship before. So I don't know if this necessarily, at least from this whole comic at all, makes me feel like negative on their potential chances. It really feels like they're just, I don't know, they're sort of like at the same point that they were at before, maybe actually even a little bit better, just in terms of them sort of dealing with each other, especially with the later scene that they have together here. But no, I thought this was, a nice way to just sort of bring it up here without any sort of real sort of like pressure on the situation, right? Like, this is just like a low bar way of getting it out there in the front end, just to show her sort of teaching the kids another sort of activity outside that also references another character that we'll see later on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a fun thing as well. Like, she's kind of using the influence of her other friend as well. That, like, hey, Ty Lee has all these kind of fun elements to her. She kind of left the typical kind of, I suppose, Fire Nation culture to join the circus, to have more kind of fun in that way, be free. Why don't I introduce some of this stuff to these kids? It's a kind of fun little connection. But yeah, she helps Ki do some of the tightrope. Liwa wants to go next. And then we get the question here, and this is very interesting. Ki asks, you knew my sister Azula when you were at the Royal Fire Academy, right? Yes, I did. What was she like? And just before we go into the flashback, we get a very interesting look on May's face, where she kind of looks off to the side, and she obviously reflects back on it quite poorly, just because the current situation with, like, Azula and May's relationship is not very good. Because again, you have to remember that Smoke and Shadow is the last kind of like incident between the two, where she kidnapped May's brother, Tom Tom. And that's like the context for this as well. So that's just happened, not to mention all the other stuff as well. But anyway, we go into the flashback, and Azula, with May behind her, confronts this girl, Hong. And just like, hey, what do you want? Oh, it's not what I want, it's what's good for you. I heard your brother was going to the front line of the war. So sorry about that. The fighting has been very fierce lately. And Hong's like, he's not stationed at the front. General Iroh promised my parents. General Iroh says a lot of things. You really shouldn't trust that old man. But my father, Prince Ozai, always keeps his word. And she's like, Azula, please, if there's anything I can do to help him, please. The next time I make an argument in debate class, support what I'm saying. What I say is always right after all. And Hong is like, well, I will. I don't know why I disagreed that one time. Of course you're always right. Yep, and now we're friends again. And she walks off very satisfied, and May is just in the background as almost like this silent enforcer, which is a really interesting position for her to be in. But it's again just to show kind of Azula's kind of manipulation to a certain degree here, that this all is informed because in debate class in the academy, this girl disagreed with her one time, and here she is threatening basically her brother to a certain degree. And knowing that this will get to her, because I think they establish later on that Hong is very close to her brother and so really wants to protect him, which is just a really interesting dynamic, just showing you that this is Azula doing anything she can to get at the other people around her, to maintain her position as the kind of dominant force at the academy, taking everyone down, targeting every weakness. Again, classic Azula. I see some people, like, I think really going in on the idea that like this is the sort of quote unquote demon child portrayal of Azula, but it's like this is very accurate to Azula as presented in the past. Like, this is the same character who basically mocked like Liu Ten's death when she heard about it and just thought about how this would benefit Ozai and stuff like that. This is accurate to that in my mind. So I think this is pretty strong here, and it will continue in the rest of the flashback. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I didn't. I thought this was pretty on par too from what we've seen so far. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that at this age she's already into this sort of, full on manipulative, sort of situation, trying to get her way in every sort of situation. But it feels like this was already sort of, I don't know, established with her before she came to the academy. At least that's what I'm getting to feel from, at least from, even the initial sort of flashback that we saw, from her before. I don't know. It feels like she was already sort of like a low-level demon child, or just very sort of, in her way of getting what she sort of wants in the situation. And this is the way that she knows to get her sort of way, because she has this sort of power and this sort of upbringing. I mean, Ki also used the power of the Fire Lord to sort of get her sort of way as well. She didn't go about it necessarily threatening anybody in that sort of way. So there's definitely a higher edge to it that Azula has, which is also kind of just a reflection of sort of the times that they're in general, with them sort of, being in the sort of war mode of the whole Fire Nation in general. So that just, doesn't really breed any sort of like compassion within the people there. And, Azula seems to be lacking with that at this point in time. So yeah, this definitely is a very telling scene, at least, how Azula's acting this current time, and, something that Mai has kept to herself even, up until this time here. And she really does seem like she's just sort of like the enforcer in the situation, with her hands behind her back, which, I don't know, it's just the way that she probably just walked around regardless, but it definitely makes it seem like she's more intimidating in this sort of situation.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that is the important point, is that like she obviously was discovered to be a firebender prior to being in the academy, which is kind of informs a lot of this stuff happening. Ozai focuses on her after that point. So yeah, she goes into the academy with that kind of Ozai has his hooks in her type approach, which Ozai's kind of what he wants from her, I guess, is effectively the same thing the academy wants. And so yeah, she comes in here with most of the traits the academy want. The academy exemplifies and amplifies all of these traits, and no one ever counters anything here. No one ever teaches her the other stuff at the same time, and that's kind of what's going on here. And again, this is also informed by like, where is this mentality also found within the royal family? The siblings are always pitted against each other. Like, we know this from like the Kyoshi novels and stuff like that. And we know that this is the case with like, Sozin and everyone and stuff like that. There is a real sense that if you're in the royal family and you have a sibling, they're part of your family, but they are your biggest rival. You have to try and defeat them basically at the same time. And we've basically been always presented with the idea to a certain degree that Ozai is kind of the biggest representative of that, because Iroh's the first in line. Ozai's trying to get the throne at all costs. So of course he triples down on the idea of, presenting someone who you have to be involved in those rivalries and push it to the limit. So feels like it connects together to me. But we come out of the flashback here, and so what May says about Azula is She was terrifying and cruel, but also I couldn't help but want to be around her because she made me feel like I mattered. Kii says, I keep thinking about when I was kidnapped by the Kamurakage, who weren't really Kamurakage at all. They were Azula and her mean friends. Yeah, I remember that. Azula's my sister. Why would she treat me like that? And Mei says, I don't know, Kii. I'm not sure that Azula knows either. So this is especially the point for like certain Azula fans who feel that maybe this isn't the best presentation of Azula. Well, here's the more maybe sympathetic view on her, where even Mei, who's been quite harsh on Azula, highlights that this is kind of the core of the friendship here. Like, she was drawn to her, wanted to be around her. Azula made her feel like she mattered, and I guess for the character that Mei was always told not to express herself, Azula maybe let her express herself like a little bit at least, and that was something that mattered to her. But then also, you know, Kii asking, why would my own sister do that to me? And Mei kind of trying to figure it out in her own head, is that like, I don't know, and I don't think Azula knows why she does some of the things she does, is effectively what they're saying here, which I think is a sympathetic kind of view on the character, is that like there is a friendship there, and Mei just on a certain level just doesn't understand why, you know, Azula almost like can't be better. That like there is hope for her, and it's like when she finally maybe realizes why she does this, maybe that's when Azula can change. I like, in that sense, like this is where I'm like, the book I feel still has a nuanced view on Azula, even if it maybe focuses from Mei's perspective on presenting some of the more bad traits of Azula primarily. But what are your thoughts on this Kii Mei conversation?
Yeah, it's interesting to sort of, you know, get the idea of the character's views on Azula and how, you know, it seemed like she almost had, you know, some good points if you were able to sort of get along with her to some degree, because, you know, she was the princess. She did have sort of this, you know, power and this sort of, you know, gravity to draw some people towards her. Maybe not necessarily all the right people or all for the right sort of reasons. But there was that sort of, you know, skill that she did have, you know, regardless of how she, you know, used it in the end, and generally towards, you know, negative and bad sort of things here. But yeah, it feels like, you know, she definitely, you know, not everyone can sort of, and we still haven't really fully sort of explored, you know, Azula's character down to sort of the minutia that, you know, people can really sort of understand her own sort of personal views, especially if we think that she herself, Azula, doesn't sort of understand, you know, sort of all of her own sort of motivations, or at least not in any sort of greater detail here. So, no, it makes sense that the other characters necessarily wouldn't, you know, fully understand her, even though they might have thought that they did at one point in time here. So, I don't know. I thought this was a good little bit to sort of, you know, try to sort of figure out Azula, which, you know, it's going to take a lot more than just, you know, these two characters trying to sort of, you know, analyze her post haste of her doing, you know, something that was generally pretty bad, even if she had a reason to why, you know, Azula was doing the whole thing with the Kamirakages.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, the other point as well here is just that, like, it makes me really, really, really want to have scenes where Kii and Azula interact, because, as I said earlier on, like, they have mostly avoided dealing with that relationship outside of, you know, okay, she kidnaps Kii, but she didn't interact with her. She kept behind the mask. There was, like, comments made by some of the other Kamurakage about Kii, but not really by Azula herself. And in a way, if Azula felt super strongly about, like, her sister in that way, you'd think that book would have had something, but there's, you know, she didn't really do anything to her beyond just kidnapping her like the other kids, which is interesting. But yeah, Azula doesn't know either is really important, because like, you go for like one of like the centerpiece moments of, say, like Zuko's arc, the who are you, what do you want? If you ask that question to Azula, she also doesn't know. That's, I think, one of the main takeaways from Azula in the Spirit Temple was definitely that she really doesn't know exactly what she wants. She's going back and forth between different ideas, gathering up new groups of people. That group of people fails or like betrays her. She forms a new group. What is her aim overall? And she needs to figure out you know, what she's doing. And I think that's May acknowledging that, like, yeah, there's a lost aspect to Azula in some regards that needs to be addressed at some point in the future. But we move on back into the flashback. May's reading a book, kind of in an upstairs kind of room, attic, and Azula pops up and is like, "Hey, were you hiding up here?" No. If you were hiding, this is a pretty cool place to do it. But no, she wasn't hiding. Guess what? Hong and Pei Jing are going to fight an Agni Kai, and May is shocked. She like falls over. What? They're friends? Not much anymore. What happened? And so they rush down. And Azula fills in May on basically what the context is behind this. You know how Hong's brother is fighting in the war. Turns out the army really needed people at the front, so he got sent there anyway. He could get hurt. Hong is a mess because of that. She's so scared for her big bro. Anyway, Hong found out that Pei Jing has been lying about being from Fire Fountain City. She's actually from the Earth Kingdom colonies. Pei Jing tried to keep it a secret, but you know how difficult it is to keep secrets in the academy. How'd Hong find out? And Azula says, I told her. If my best friend was Earth Kingdom colony trash, I'd want to know too. Who knew Hong would take it so hard? So we see here that, and we'll get more of this as we go forward, Azula has sort of manipulated this Agni Kai into happening. Already we know she's kind of influenced the whole thing with Hong and her brother, and now she's influenced the whole secret about this girl's actually from the Earth Kingdom colonies. And again, it's like, is this all back to because Hong disagreed with her that one time in debate class, even though she has her on her side now? It's like, you still did that one time, and she's making this happen. Very, very interesting scene. But I also like that it is a little bit more casual between the two at the start. You know, Azula saying, you know, it's a cool place to hide. And, you know, she wasn't hiding. And it also kind of highlights, like, May's character, that, like, she would often kind of be by herself reading books. Maybe this is where she learned about the bugs on her own outside, that sort of thing. But what are your thoughts on this scene?
Yeah, I like this. I'd like, you know, May just sort of being chill and sort of doing her own sort of thing, showing that, you know, she isn't necessarily like a full Azula lackey just following her, you know, all over the place. Like, you know, she has her own sort of, you know, motivations and things that she wants to do. But, you know, she's also concerned about the situation that has seemingly been, you know, manipulated and sort of orchestrated by Azula here. So just showing more the lengths of her, you know, sort of controlling the situation and sort of setting the stage for different things, and just sort of giving the idea of how the academy operates overall, and sort of how, you know, you can't sort of keep anything sort of hidden here, any sort of secrets. You know, this is just sort of how the academy sort of operates on this sort of level here. And, you know, even though the situation seems kind of odd, you know, considering that they were friends, this, you know, might necessarily not be sort of completely out of the norm.
Mm-hmm. And then we get into the actual incident itself. So everyone's kind of gathered around. They're aware a fight's about to happen. Then suddenly Headmistress Pearl and her sidekick Shihan come out. And May thinks like, oh, Agni Kai's not going to happen. The teachers are going to stop this, surely. But Azula is like, just watch. And so Pearl comes over to the two of them and like, you two have a quarrel with each other. Yes. And then Pei Jing actually says no. So Hong says yes, the other says no. They get into a little bit of their argument here. You know, my brother's risking his life for the Fire Nation while this traitor walks among us. She's an Earth Kingdom sympathizer. And she's just like, yeah, okay, yeah, I was born in the Earth Kingdom colonies. It doesn't make me a traitor. That's messed up. But Hong pushes forward and is like, no, I know you're a sympathizer. You hang out with rebel Earth Kingdom rebels when you're not hanging out with me. And it's like, that's a lie. And Azula just casually to May is just like, I made up that part. But who knows? It might be true. And so Pearl says, well, it seems your friend is calling you a traitor. Are you going to take that? No. Fight me. And so the teachers effectively organize an official Agni Kai at this point. Let everyone here be witness to this Agni Kai. Should any fool cast doubt upon your honor, it's your responsibility as children of the Fire Nation to make that person pay for their crime. Remember, you are nothing without your honor. And May is stunned that the teachers are not going to stop this. You see Shihan in the background just watching on, like, yep, this is how we do things. May notes they could really hurt each other here, and Azula's like, exactly. And so, just before we get into the actual action, what are your thoughts on the build up to this, finding out more about Azula's manipulations, but mainly the teachers being for it, like being very positive actually about it, that this is the way we resolve things as true Fire Nation people.
Yeah. This really paints the sort of stage of how the academy operates, or how, the Fire Nation in general sort of operates, especially when you get sort of the final sort of resolution from the headmistress. But even the idea that they're sort of letting this go here. I mean, they anytime you mention honor in the Fire Nation, something is going to go down here. So that's like the key word here that we see here. Like, Zuko would be all about this, unfortunately, if this was him in this sort of situation here. But yeah, I mean, see how the sidekick at this point in time, just sort of lets things sort of slide here. But I don't know. It's interesting to see, Mistress Pearl and sort of her way of presenting the situation to the students here, how she already looks, sort of quite old. So now you can sort of understand why they said that she has to be over like 100 at the later point when we see her, in Mai's current time. So yeah, no, this is definitely something to see, and it's unfortunate that this sort of situation has all gone down, considering, Azula sort of, again, has sort of pushed events to be this, and has even sort of made stuff up here. So I don't know. Yeah, this is definitely something, and sad to see how this turns out.
Yeah, and especially the line of like, you hang out with Earth Kingdom rebels when you're not hanging out with me. So they are actually, like, I guess, pretty close friends. But because the seed of doubt has been planted in the mind about like something more serious, that just goes away. And that's really telling for what we'll see in the present day kind of set up for an Agni Kai in a few pages' time. But yeah, the fight begins. So there's a Hong fires a fire kick, Paging blocks. There's a jumping kind of like kick here. There's an attempt with fire daggers that kind of goes in here. Seems like Hong has the advantage, pushes in for the kill, but this leaves her open for the actual finishing blow. Paging prepares a shot right to the stomach. Shoom. We don't see the hit, but Hong goes down. Everyone is stunned except Azula, who watches on like, I made this happen. And she seems just happy that Hong is hurt, I guess, in this situation. But you also see that what has also happened here is that like Pei Jing has like a look in her eyes after this, that she's just like actually maybe like injured someone properly for the first time. And it's like, oh, have we awakened something? Have we turned this girl into something now because of this crazy situation that should never happen at a school for, I don't know, what, 6, 7, 8-year-olds? Most of these characters. And that's the crazy thing in all of this. So what are your thoughts on the actual Agni Kai itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing sort of super crazy or anything, but it shows some definitely skill and some training that they've had, sort of being in the academy and stuff like that. So I don't know, I think it's pretty serious. I mean, firebending in itself can be sort of pretty destructive, even at sort of like the lower level, you could say here. But it seems like at least this point in time, most of the kids here aren't so sort of like jaded in their idea of the Fire Nation Academy that they're like immediately all for this. It really seems like it's only like Azula who sort of has already been conditioned enough to sort of be really into this, or not have any sort of effect on this sort of situation. Even the winner of the Agni Kai looks like she's a bit sort of shocked at the sort of system here and what she's actually been able to do. So I don't know. It's definitely something to see such young kids in this particular sort of situation that you necessarily wouldn't see to this degree, or would have already sort of been broken up by the teachers and stuff, which is what Nomai sort of expected in the beginning.
Yeah, and it's we'll get this in the present day kind of Agni Kai setup that's meant to kind of mirror this, but the idea of like, and the reason we couldn't have resolved this in any other way is, and it's because of like you mentioned, the word honor got brought up, and in the Fire Nation that causes issues, it seems like. They want that to be a thing of like, make everything about your honor so it can come to an Agni Kai and you can prove you are the best, and it's all about that sort of idea. But anyway, yeah, they get Hong some medical attention, and she then asks the audience what's the lesson we just learned? Azula puts up her hand. So Azula gives the answer. Do not trust anyone, not even your friends. They will always try to undermine you. Be better than them so you can defeat them when they turn on you. And everyone's a bit like shocked by like that answer. But Pearl is just like, yeah, sure, that'll do. And she kind of echoes this basically. Remember, children, strive to be better than the person next to you. You never know when you'll need to take them down. Now get back to your classes. So everyone walks off. May looks back and she locks eyes for a second with Shihan. With the idea, I suppose, being that like effectively these are the two characters who sort of like both in the past stood in silence and didn't do anything to intervene. Obviously in this case, May blaming Shihan for being in a position where maybe she should have intervened, and we'll see that kind of echoed in just a second. So this is the point here. Like, this is what the Academy teaches. They want you to feel this way about your fellow pupils. Is, you know, try to be better than the person next to you because you might need to take them down one day. And then the fact that Azula's angle on it is like, don't trust anyone, even people you're friends with, because they'll betray you one day. So you have to be better than them, so almost you can betray them first. And you can sort of see that, like, well, that's why the Academy certainly didn't help. She came in with that approach. It echoes the Academy's approach. Of course she ended up in the way she ended up, where ultimately people betraying her affected her so badly when it happens in ATLA itself. So really, I think, nicely written stuff for like thinking about where things go in the future. But what are your thoughts on the lesson here at the end of the Agni Kai?
Yeah, the future of the Fire Nation and the sort of kids and how they're sort of going to, you know, portray themselves going forward really comes out here, because it definitely sort of sets the stage that you really have to sort of basically like watch your back at all times. Like you can't really, you know, you can't really have any sort of level of trust, which I think is something that, you know, sort of, you know, Azula really didn't have, and, you know, sort of kept herself all these sort of years here. So she wasn't able to really sort of form any sort of, you know, potential sort of true relationships, which doesn't feel like the Academy even sort of like considered that, you know, at all. Like, I don't know, maybe just the idea of them always sort of being at war, and they wanted to breed people who were, you know, as strong as they can be to be, you know, the leaders of the Fire Nation going forward, which is, you know, that has a valid way of doing things and, you know, sort of keeping the nation strong. But, you know, there was potentially some way they could have balanced that, but at least the Academy at that point in time didn't have that perspective sort of at all here. But yeah, it's interesting to see that, you know, Maya and Shihan had, you know, this sort of moment here that, you know, will eventually get called back to, especially at this sort of younger age here. Like, you wouldn't necessarily expect Maya to sort of, you know, jump in this sort of situation, not at this sort of younger age here, and, you know, especially not being a firebender. Like, you know, how would that particularly work in this sort of instance here? But definitely feels like it's something that, you know, will be important as we see later on.
Mm-hmm. So we cut back to kind of fun times in May's class, where they mess around with cicada beetles. Kind of they build an enclosure for them. They kind of bury them so they can come out when they need to. Then someone comes in and is like, hey, May, there's a fight happening outside. You need to make them stop. So May rushes out to deal with this. She tells the others to stay back there, but Ki and Liwa basically kind of follow her out, basically. So we see a similar situation happening. Two girls arguing with each other, and it's about to maybe get violent. So what we get here is, I heard you talking about me behind my back, Dew. You and Chang are always talking about me. We weren't saying anything, Chen. Grow up. So you're a liar. Not only are you talking Fire Dung, but you're a coward about it too. Okay, you got me. They were telling me about how paranoid you've been lately. Way to prove her wrong. What's going on? She's spreading lies about me. I'm not. 1 minute we're friends, then she freaks out and says I'm plotting against her. So May asks, why do you think this? My mom warned me about the Academy. She said every friend I made here was secretly looking for a way to destroy me, so I had to get to them first. And May's reaction here is like perfect to everything going on at the academy. She just like basically face palms effectively, and it's just like, oh, this school that even in this new era where things should be better, it's like the previous generation that experienced the academy in the old way. They're telling the kids in the new academy the same approach of like, be on guard, betray them before they betray you. Especially the wording given here, like they're secretly looking for a way to destroy me, so I had to get to them first. It's pretty crazy, I think, the statement that happens here. We'll get to what happens next in just a second here, but what are your thoughts on this? Because I really like the way they set up this kind of present day Agni Kai after just telling us about the one in the past. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that that works pretty well because they're using the sort of older generation that sort of they know the sort of the history of the academy, right? Or at least how the academy was brought up, and that's sort of what Zuko mentioned in the beginning, or Zuko and Ursa about how are the parents going to get along with things, and you can see that the parents their influence on their children, just as Maya was influenced to get sort of to befriend sort of Azula in the beginning here. You can see sort of it, basically sort of trickle down here because it doesn't really feel like this is, such a big issue that they really, sort of need to get into sort of like a fight over. Like this is, in the grand scheme of things, rather small, at least compared to the other Agni Kai that we saw, which again probably also could have been resulted in different ways. But especially back then, tensions were even sort of higher than they are now. So from that perspective, this seems very sort of low level in terms of the seriousness of the situation. But like anything else, tensions can run sort of high and situations can turn out differently here. But I like that Mai is immediately sort of trying to sort of jump in here and sort of calm the situation down, considering sort of what has happened in the past and what she's seen happen in the past.
Mm-hmm. And then we get like pretty much like the centerpiece confrontation of the book. Shihan comes out and is like, well, are you going to allow Chen to smear your name across school grounds, or are you going to stand up for you? And they're like, Headmistress? The foundations of the Fire Nation are built on a bedrock of honor. Someone has questioned that honor, then you must defend it. Will you stand up for your honor or slink off like cowards? And May is like, wait, you want them to fight? And again, the way you should be thinking about this is effectively, this is May in the past Shihan position, and Shihan now in the past Pearl position. But the difference is that May is speaking up. She's going against the kind of grain here. Shihan says they have a disagreement. There's one way to settle it for proud Fire Nation tradition. May is like, there are thousands of ways to deal with disagreements that do not involve fighting an Agni Kai. Agni Kais have been a part of the Fire Nation since its birth. It's part of our culture, our blood, it's tradition. And May gets really angry here and it's like, you keep saying that word tradition. Maybe it's time the Fire Nation threw some of its traditions in the garbage and tried something new. As headmistress of the Royal Fire Academy, I have the sacred duty to teach these children to be strong. I won't let down generations of women who came before me. May interrupts and says, the generations of headmistresses who came before you didn't teach Fire Nation kids how to be strong. They traumatized them. They taught them to fear their friends and be suspicious of their neighbors. All this talk of great Fire Nation leaders, you didn't make great leaders, you made Azula. Do you remember Azula, don't you? When she was playing at Fire Lord, she was so paranoid she banished everyone close to her. The education the Royal Fire Academy gives to these kids hurts them. I'm putting an end to it. And we see the reaction from Ki and Liwa is yay Sifu Mei, because she's, dominating this scene here. Everything she's saying is completely correct. Shihan desperately tries to defend herself. That's not true. The Academy has done so much. You've got to stop lying to yourself about this. Do you really think it's healthy to encourage kids to fight Agni Kais? I remember the Agni Kai that was fought here when I was a kid. You were a teacher. You could have stood up to Headmistress Pearl, but you didn't. You just let it happen. She says, it's Fire Nation tradition. Not anymore. Get back to your classes. Fun's over. And that is the end of the situation. This is how you prevent a minor argument from becoming an Agni Kai. And it's definitely, in my mind, the best section of the book because it shows everything that the book is kind of about. Because Shihan will go on a character arc after this. It's the kind of central core of this is why May is here doing this, is to say this piece. And it like involves Azula as a big part of like what May actually says against the Academy. And just the way they mirrored again the past versus the present Agni Kai, it's really, really well done. What are your thoughts on these couple of pages here?
Yeah, no, this is a great way to compare the past and the present and being able to sort of stick up for the situation and diffuse it in sort of a more peaceful way. Like it doesn't necessarily give you like a full conclusion to whatever their sort of issue is here, but it does, take it to the point where they don't have to fight and there's no sort of like injury for something that, doesn't really need to have a full-on battle for. Like there's a lot of other issues that might be higher stakes that would require someone to actually sort of support their honor in the situation. But a schoolyard sort of squabble doesn't really feel like it sort of needs to be at that sort of level here. It definitely feels like this would have been exactly the situation where this could have resolved into that sort of fight here if it would let it go to the way that it was in the past. But no, I think Mai did a good job here sort of explaining, how, the people that came out of the academy before who were sort of indoctrinated into this sort of, way of fighting didn't necessarily turn out too well. And, Azula is a good sort of, I guess, point of reference here because she definitely would have, taken the fight here and probably have won, but that wouldn't necessarily have solved anything. It just would have made the other person more resentful in the situation and even more sort of paranoid, which doesn't necessarily, lead to a healthy lifestyle going forward here. So no, I really like, my sort of standing up for the situation here and sort of, getting Sihan to at least think about the situation at least a little bit here. Because, it seems like she has, she just keeps saying Fire Nation tradition, which is a nice sort of word there, but it doesn't really, speak more to it. Maybe if she could explain sort of the history of the tradition of the Agni Kais or something along those lines and some sort of historical reference, maybe then there might have been a reason for it to actually sort of go forward here. But she doesn't even sort of have that sort of backing behind her sort of statement here. So sort of falls sort of flat here in the situation here. So no, I like that Mai's able to sort of diffuse this, and I don't know. I think it's cool that she seems to have the power in the school in order to sort of enforce this, which is interesting considering the headmaster, technically should sort of outrank her in this situation. So I don't know if that's sort of like the Zuko backing of the Fire Lord that allows her to do this, or just her own sort of strong personality that was able to sort of overcome the situation.
Yeah, like I think it's just that like May has sort of in this instance could have just like destroyed like the leader's confidence, where it's just like, okay, we can see who's in charge in this scene. That like even if she wanted to, she can't kind of counter this because she's doubting things, as we kind of will learn in just a second. But yeah, this is really strong here. I like that the core of this is like May could be using Azula as an example because it's the Academy made Azula. Like they're basically saying, you made Azula paranoid. That doesn't make for a good leader. Like good leaders need to trust people, which is an interesting one in that like that's kind of a point they'll make later with Zuko, kind of learning better. He's made an effort to trust the people around him a lot more to become the right leader, and he is the destined leader at the moment for the Fire Nation. So there's that kind of comparison there, which I think is really good. And yeah, it's a perfect thing the way that they kind of reference that of just like, yeah, Azula is strong in many, many ways, but when you actually make her the leader, it was so clear that it got to her. Who can she trust now that she's on the top? And is that what you actually want? And again, the point she made earlier on in the book, did the Fire Nation win the war after this amazing setup? No. Did we make the ultimate leader? No. Instead, it's like you made Azula, who is now this character who is out there a little bit directionless and doesn't know what she's about, why she does the things she does. The Academy is partially responsible for that. And that's a huge kind of point in all of this. That's like just really good. Not to mention it's May just hitting it home and getting to the point of like kids shouldn't fight Agni Kais. Like that's the core point that's being made here. It's maybe presenting the whole thing about like, you know, in this modern era, does the Fire Nation need Agni Kais like at all? And I'd like to know in like say Korra era, are like Agni Kais like necessarily still a thing? Because to a certain degree, I suppose you could say for maybe like adults, it maybe makes it a way where like actually because of honor when they're like older, sometimes this is maybe the better way to handle certain situations to prevent things from being bigger, going into wars. Instead, it's an Agni Kai fought between two leaders rather than two armies having to clash over some sort of a conflict. So it's interesting. Like I don't think the book's maybe trying to make too much of a statement about like all Agni Kais in the Fire Nation and it as a fundamental thing, but certainly that like they're like 7 years old. They should not in any way be considering fighting an Agni Kai, or that this is something that could happen to them at this level of school. That's, I think, the point that's being made here. But do you have any thoughts on the point about Agni Kais? Do you think it is specifically kid Agni Kais, or is it saying something about the concept overall?
No, that's a good point. I mean, I think the headmistress would probably say it's about them sort of like overall, because she keeps trying to mention that it's like a Fire Nation thing, a Fire Nation tradition, like that's sort of their history. So they should sort of, understand that sort of aspect even from a young age versus Mai's just, I think she's definitely more of the mindset that, this sort of level of issue between two different, kids, especially younger students, doesn't need to have a fight between them. Like that doesn't bode well for them and they're going forward. And that's not a decent way of conflict resolution. At least that's what I think she's saying here, especially since she says there's like thousands of other ways to sort of do it here. So I don't think it here specifically, it's not going in that deep in terms of like the history of the Agni Kais and how that plays into the grander scheme of things. Like if it's between, like leaders versus, their actual sort of nations or the islands that are fighting with each other. Like I'm sure there is some sort of historical, reason that they could make up or that there is for, Agni Kais, which I think would be cool to find out. How that actually sort of came to be a thing. Just the idea of dueling and stuff like that. There's a history to that and there's a reason for that. So I think that definitely could be explored later on, but I don't think we're quite getting into that right here. Here it just seems like it's just a thing that they do because they've always done, which might not necessarily be the right thing.
Yeah, because the other connection with I suppose the Academy and Agni Kais is from the Kyoshi novels, that like Heiron fought Agni Kais for like the leadership position of the Academy, like the headmistress position.
Yeah.
Which they don't necessarily go into here. Like the book isn't really like about that, but that's kind of like another example of that, where like Rangi reflects on that as like that's a bit of a like, ooh, like how many people did my mother kill to like get to that position, using like Agni Kais as that example. But that's not necessarily what the focus is, but it's another Academy Agni Kai connection. But the next scene is that basically, I suppose that evening, Shihan goes to see Pearl, and Pearl is like, "Oh, how's my beloved Academy kind of faring?" Shihan talks about the struggles here of like Zuko trying to initiate a new curriculum and stuff like that, and she's starting to wonder. And Pearl is like, "What are you starting to wonder?" One of the former students has returned to teach at the academy. She has bad memories of the school and what she was taught there. We told ourselves we thought the Fire Nation's children the way we did so that they would become great leaders, great warriors, people of purpose. But what if we were wrong? And she points out a thousand generations of Fire Nation tradition isn't wrong. What if it is? What if instead of molding the children to become their best, we taught them cruelty and fear? What if there's another way? There's no other way to raise Fire Nation children, you silly girl. They learn to be strong or they perish. Simple as that. And Shihan, you can see, is beginning to develop a little bit of a backbone here. I see. Do you see, child? Because I see doubt on your face. Remember your duty to the school and your duty to me. Of course. I can't. And she confronts her, Pearl, at this point. You can. I took you in. You, the useless third daughter of a minor noble house, you had no future and I gave you one. How dare you turn on me? But Shihan stands up. I'm grateful for what you've done for me in the past, headmistress, but I am headmistress now, and I will guide my students how I see fit. How dare you? Yes, you said that already. I've noticed something, Headmistress Pearl. You have no power over me. I hope someday you will find peace. Goodbye. And she leaves, and we get the very interesting development that Shihan has actually listened to what May has said and agreed with her, and we'll come to that in just a second. But as she leaves, Pearl's butler, I guess, comes in, and we get this like kind of surprise line here from Pearl. Shihan has betrayed me. Tell your Dai Li brother it's time for you to earn your keep. And it's like, wait, what's happening here? And you know the connection here to a certain degree here, because it's like, oh yeah, Dai Li agents, Fire Nation. She's old school. She supports, you know, the way the Academy does things. Azula is the ultimate product. The Dai Li also felt that way basically about Azula. She was the ultimate leader to them to a certain degree. And it's like, oh, what are we doing here? Very surprised turn for the book to take. But what are your thoughts on this conversation here between Pearl and Shihan?
Yeah, this is something. I mean, I think it's, interesting that Shihan actually goes to her and is able to sort of basically like sort of see through it. Like she works through sort of her, her previous sort of reservations in sort of like real time here when she confronts someone who has sort of the 100% sort of old mentality here. So, it's interesting to see that she already sort of seemed to kind of have sort of doubts here. And this was really sort of like the tipping point where she was actually going, it felt like she was sort of going to sort of reaffirm her belief in sort of the old ways here, but she was actually pushed more, sort of the opposite direction here, which I think is, it speaks to her having, some positive traits in her sort of character development here. Like, maybe you could say maybe it was sort of too quick, but it feels like she was already sort of along those ideas that, maybe things didn't turn out, the best for things before, and, there needs to be sort of a change in the future here. So no, I thought it was interesting to see sort of the old headmistress, how she currently is, how she's basically, sort of on like a Ozai X sort of drone, right? Because she's just sort of in this room with the fire in the back and sort of the cast shadow. So like, they have all the sort of, key things there to sort of show sort of this sort of old sort of way of how people were presenting themselves in the past. It'd be interesting to see how Zuko sits on the throne now and how that sort of, gets taken from current people, coming up to him. But yeah, this is definitely, interesting to see sort of this sort of old school sort of character and how she, feels betrayed at the sort of situation here and sort of the bringing in the Dai Li and how that's going to sort of play out, which I think is interesting because, I mean, you can tell that the character there is sort of like unique in his sort of, appearance there that isn't so your typical sort of Fire Nation sort of citizen here. So it's definitely something to see that you wouldn't necessarily, I guess you consider, expect to still be around. But just because, Zuko's been cleaning things up doesn't mean everything is 100% hunky-dory at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like this scene because you also see that it's kind of like an echo of the previous Mei Shihan scene in terms of like, it's the old school person being like, no, we stick to the traditions. But what about this? The traditions aren't wrong. And Shihan eventually hits a point where it's like, this is how Mei must have felt talking to me earlier, because she's just repeating the same thing over and over again. Like, does she actually care about the girls at the academy? And it's like, not really. And then the fact that when it's clear there's a disagreement, she's just like, look at what I did for you. I helped you. I took you from a lower rank and made you into a higher position. And she kind of realizes like, oh, here's the rank issue that like isn't really a thing anymore in the Fire Nation. You don't have that power over me. Moves on and can kind of be this better person kind of going forward. It's very interesting and very telling with Pearl that immediately it's like, yeah, take her out. Like it's an assassination hit call that happens immediately here. And that's like, okay. Like I guess Pearl absolutely ascribes to the academy type thing. You've, besmirched my honor, so I'm going to have you taken out. Um, but yeah, we cut to the next scene, which is back at the academy in the morning, before the kids are there, I guess. Mei and Shihan have a conversation. Mei thinks it's going to be another argument, but actually, Shihan is like straight away, I've given what you said thought. I think you're right. Oh, wow. You asked me the other day why I didn't stop that Agni Kai while you were a student here. I watched 2 Agni Kais happen while I was a student at the academy and 3 while I was a teacher. I thought it was the way the Fire Nation was. We were violent people with violent pasts and a violent future. Then I met you and believed that there was a different future waiting for the Fire Academy's daughters. I want to believe that too. And she walks off and May's just like, okay then. And that is, for the most part, like the resolution of, quote-unquote, the main plot of the book, in terms of Zuko has asked Mei to become a teacher here to check if the headmistress is going to do things right. Well, because of this kind of confrontation from before, and now this conversation, she's going to do things the right way. She now has hope and believes that Mei's approach, which is basically Zuko's approach, is the right way to do things and to go for a better future, basically. So the academy is going to go in a good direction, I guess, from this point on. And you get that resolution here already, and the rest of it is just there's an assassination attempt kind of incoming and a little bit more character work to be done. But what are your thoughts on this conversation?
Yeah, no, I like this. This is a nice sort of, quick sort of ish sort of resolution to sort of the issue that they had here. But I like that it speaks to sort of like a better future of the academy, and sort of realizing that, the Fire Nation isn't all about sort of violence. Like, she says that like 3 times in that little blurb there. So there's, I think that they're seeing that there's an ability, that there's more of what they have been in the past, which I think is a good way to have, some hope for the future, right? Like, this is just the hope for the newer generation to do things differently than they have in the past. And this is a great way to sort of implement it. So no, I thought this was a good way to sort of start them on this path here. And they seemed to, it seemed like Sihan was already sort of, along this sort of idea that maybe there is a way to do better things, but she needed the push and someone in the right position to sort of, enforce and to help her, have this sort of belief already.
Mm-hmm. So then we get another quick montage through another day at school, showing how successful kind of Mei in the academy is, showing like the Beatles. They do actually show a scene of her inside, like reading a book, so more of a kind of normal class, but still she has them kind of gathered around her pretty up close. Then the tightrope walking outside. So everyone seems happy when they leave for the day, and Mei seems happy too. And then out of nowhere, who shows up but Ty Lee, and Zuko is also here. So we get to see these two in some new outfits, which is kind of cool. Ty Lee, what are you doing here? She hugs Mei. You know how I feel about hugging. I know you absolutely love hugs, especially from me. What are you doing here? Took a break from chasing Azula all over the place to visit family. And Zuko told me that you were teaching at our old school. I had to see this. And she turns to Zuko and says, and you're just visiting too? I hadn't heard from you in a while. You're checking up on me? I'm not checking up on you. I wanted to see how the academy was doing. Sounds like checking up to me. And so we get into this little bit of a kind of argument sort of here. Mei, I'm really not. And she says, Zuko, you said you trusted me. I don't need you hovering over me, making sure I'm following whatever noble plan you've set out for the Fire Nation. Zuko says, you're right. I shouldn't be here. The Fire Nation is a mess. So many entrenched bureaucrats trying to keep things exactly as they were under my father. I need to do a better job at trusting the people I know are on my side. You said it. And Ty Lee pops in between the two of them and is like, oh, you guys, that was beautiful. Resolving an argument without knives or firebending or anything. I'm so proud of you. And so May's like, okay, since you're here, let me give you the tour of the place. And Ty Lee just says, yeah, I want to see if that, if what I carved on the wall of the second floor bathroom is still there. And the action's about to kick off in just a second. But yeah, this is a cool thing. Ty Lee, who we noted was in the flashback, enters the story here in the present day as this kind of burst of kind of bubbly energy here. And then we get into the little bit of a, this actually like addresses, I suppose, why the breakup between Mei and Zuko happened in the first place. It was, again, back in the promise over Zuko being so kind of stressed about being the leader of the Fire Nation at that early point that he kind of retreated into himself and started not really trusting the people around him. And that's kind of what informed the breakup. And as we see over the course of this book, he's been better as a leader, stronger. And in this case, we see here better kind of communicator, but also kind of realizing that, like, yeah, I'm trying to be better about trusting the people I know are on my side. But at the same time, it's also like, he's checking in on her like 3 or 4 days into the job, while also kind of bringing Ty Lee to see her. It's like, why does May react kind of so strongly to him just like seeing what's going on? And I like that Ty Lee is the one to really note that, like, wow, you two handled that really well, maybe unlike previous times. So there's like this hope that like things are getting a lot more relaxed between the two of them, and you can tell maybe that she also, like Key, is a bit of a shipper of these two, and that like maybe in the future at some point when a little bit more time has passed, these two might kind of develop back into a relationship. I think we all feel this is the end game ship. May is Azumi's mother, that sort of thing. It's just with where this comic is set, what the comics are doing right now, are they going to do a big book that reunites the couple? It's hard to know what the plan is for some of those bigger plot points. But what are your thoughts on this scene between the kind of new Fire Nation teen trio here that we maybe haven't seen that much of? Smoke and Shadow, we saw a bit of this. Ty Lee, Zuko, May.
Yeah, no, I like the dynamic here. I mean, I think, whenever you, like you said, getting Ty Lee back into the mix is definitely a burst of like energy just from her personality and her sort of, just general demeanor with them and everything like that. So I thought that's always fun to sort of see her back here, especially being from the academy. Even though she doesn't get any sort of mention in the sort of flashbacks, it's cool just to see her here and to see that she has, some memory of things that she's done here. And that definitely feels like something that, would be on her to like sort of carve something somewhere. But yeah, I think, I don't know, Zuko being there, I mean, he is checking up. I guess I can see sort of the idea why he might sort of need to trust people a bit more. But I guess considering how much, pushback he's getting, maybe it's not sort of, surprising that he would check in on the situation there. But I don't know. I think it's cool that they're able to sort of at least sort of talk this out relatively quickly here and sort of, get to the bottom of the issues that they have. I think, that's something that old Zuko definitely wouldn't have been able to done or wouldn't have been able to sort of express that quickly in that sort of amount of time. So no, I think it definitely shows growth on all the characters' point here. And yeah, I think, Ty Lee definitely would, have them pegged to be back in a relationship with each other, if that was, so to be a thing. So no, I thought this was good. It's a really sort of quick way of just, getting the characters back together here and sort of a short moment here.
And because they don't really address this for the rest of the book, I suppose we'll use maybe here to address the point of what is the future of like content, I suppose, involving May and Zuko. Like, they have been broken up like IRL since 2012, like the end of the Promise, basically, or early-ish Promise, actually. It's been a very long time IRL, but not that long in universe. We're having situations where it's like many years between like appearances of these characters. Obviously, the last couple of years of comics have been kind of characterized by maybe not really advancing things much going forward, not having hugely big moments happen. Are they saving the reveal of them being back together for like the movie? Casually just doing it there? Now that it's been confirmed, now the comics can go back and sort of show the moment they got back together? Or are they setting up that maybe one of those movies, if they're all ATLA focused, will be a little bit more Fire Nation focused, and it will have stuff like one of the plots will be May and Zuko getting back together once and for all when they're older, plus maybe the Azula redemption arc happens in one of those movies. Or what? Like, what are your thoughts on like the future for the relationship we assume is destined to happen at some point in the...
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good one. Like, where does this put them? I guess this really depends on sort of like how much they view this in sort of the fandom as being something that people really sort of care about. I think it's pretty popular, but I'm not sure in sort of like the the more general audience of people who like the show, how high this rates on their sort of importance, that is something that they would dedicate, part of a movie towards this sort of relationship, even if it is sort of in a quick sort of fashion, and then eventually they start showing it sort of comics. I don't know. I think it would be cool and it would make sense if they were to sort of show sort of a lot of the like, official-ish endgame sort of relationships in the movie, and then they can sort of move forward from there. I think that would make, a lot of sense for me to get the most bang out of your buck. But I guess it really depends on the movies and what their sort of focus is and what their sort of like story is. Because, maybe it's not sort of worth it to have that sort of relationship there. But I don't know. I do hope that they do at some point figure out how they want to wrap this up in any sort of form or fashion, because it does feel like it's sort of been hanging on the thread for a long while, even if it hasn't been a lot of time, in the actual Avatar universe in terms of, the timeline of things. But yeah, I don't know. I think, there has to be someone there because we know, the relationships and stuff go on and the lineage continues. So there's going to be something there. I don't know. It would be interesting if they were to introduce like a whole new character that we don't really know anything about at this point in time. But I don't know. There's a lot of time there, years wise, when they could do other things. So I guess they could do something new if they really wanted to.
Mm. Yeah, because I suppose it has to address the idea of they switched to one-shot comics for a reason, away from the trilogies, because they didn't want to, I guess, have to write the new stuff while also keeping in mind ongoing like big trilogies where like I suppose it needs to be acknowledged that like The Promise, The Search, The Rift, Smoke and Shadow, a lot of those early comics, they did big things with the characters. Like they had major plot points in them. Like the stuff that happens in The Promise is pretty impactful. The Search, of course, is a huge comic with Ursa. The Rift, covering like Toph and like her father and stuff like that. There's notable things where like you might actually have to consider what would or would not happen in a couple more big comics. So that's where like stuff like this is like, are they just waiting to do the reveals in the movies and then the comics are free to tell some stories? Or are we just going to see a comic at some point where they do just get back together? Because the breakup is a comic plot point. And so the question is sort of like, did they want to sort of like wrap up a lot of these plots in the comics so that they don't have to explain anything in the movies? That like you can just be like, Mei and Zuko are together. If you read the comics, you know they broke up and got back together. If you haven't read the comics, well, you never knew about that, so they were just together. And there's a slight bit of extra context you can have. That's the sort of, I suppose, maybe question that they're more dealing with in terms of like, what way do they want to actually handle this overall? Which is why I kind of think like, especially with the relationship one here, I do think they'll probably just introduce Zuko and it's just like, hey, here's Mei. And they'll just establish that they're in a relationship and there'll be no reference to the fact that they were broken up. It's just in canon, they're back together at this point. And then we know that at some point after Ashes of the Academy, but leading up to the Aang movie or whatever, they do get back together. And we're just waiting for that exact story. Because I think a lot of fans just want them back together. And sure, we'd like a nice story with that, but people just want the results, I think is the takeaway. But there's that. So yeah, we get into the action in the next couple of pages here. So they, as May's giving the tour, they go over to like Shihan's office and the two Dai Li agents are outside. They're just about to go in. Shihan answers the door and May's like, were you expecting them? No. Immediately earthbending. So straight through the floor, the Dai Li agent attacks. Enough, bury them. And yeah, they jump into action here. We have a pretty nice squad here. Ty Lee, one of the top non-benders. Zuko's super powerful, of course, in the comics. Mei doesn't have her weapons with her, but is still a strong combatant, as we'll see. Earthbenders in the Royal Fire Academy, that's new. Don't hurt Shihan. And Ty Lee's like, yeah, Mei, use a knife. Wait, you don't bring knives with you? This place really has changed you. I like that line. Zuko kicks down the door. Mei still has throwing focus, so she takes off one of her shoes, throws it at the cicada beetle enclosure, and this distracts the Dai Li guards. This allows Shihan to escape. as the fight sort of continues. Zuko takes on one of the agents, Ty Lee takes on the other. And we get some nice stuff here showing like Ty Lee's acrobatics, her dodging up close, Zuko with his fire daggers, of course. They're at a slight disadvantage, I guess, in an enclosed space against powerful earthbenders, but these characters have this currently. And then we get the stuff here. Friends of the Fire Lord, the true Fire Lord, before you took her throne, you're working for Azula, we're waiting for her return. She'll reward those who were loyal and punish those who betrayed her. That does sound like my sister, especially the punishing part. So he then continues to attack Zuko, but then he takes a book to the face, and we get what has for some reason become the most controversial line in this entire book. May says the line, "Another Azula fan for the garbage heap," as another book connects with him in the face. We'll, I guess, quickly just wrap up this kind of fight scene here. It continues on. Eventually, Ty Lee, I suppose, ends up chi blocking the guys. One's been taken out by the book, the other by chi blocking. The classroom is a bit wrecked, but they have dealt with this conflict. Shihan then is seen dragging the portrait of Pearl outside and smashing it in half. And she's very frustrated about this turn of events. We'll get into the conversation in just a second here, but let's first talk about the fight scene, then we'll get into the controversial thing that I mentioned in a second. What were your thoughts on this, the action scene in the book?
I liked it. I think this was, a very sort of like short action scene, but for this type of book, I think it worked pretty well. Them sort of coming to sort of abduct or assassinate maybe the headmistress here, because of her sort of disagreements in the academy here, which seems a bit sort of extreme, but considering how the Fire Nation used to be, maybe that's sort of like on par with the way things used to be, which is what they're sort of trying to change, right? So no, I thought the fight was cool. It's always cool to get to see Dai Li agents because they're pretty skilled earthbenders. They're like above, average earthbenders that really have the ability to take on our sort of, main core people and sort of like a meaningful way here. Like, I think at this point, most of our main characters know how to fight the Dai Li sort of like on par, or they're just skilled enough to fight them. So it's not sort of completely like outclassing them as it was sort of like when we first met the Dai Li agents. So, they're on par with their levels and stuff like that. So I like that sort of, level in terms of the battle here. And yeah, I think it's cool to see Mai has changed. Like, she doesn't have sort of the knives with her. She's trying to set a good example, right? Which I think is, that's a good way to sort of see things for the future, to sort of act in the right way. But no, I think it's cool that she's able to use her abilities, and Ty Lee's always cool with the chi blocking and chi bending. So no, I think this was a neat way to see this. And I think, the fact that it is all inside, definitely contains the fire bending, so Zuko just sort of can't go sort of all out, and him using his classic sort of fire dagger. So no, I thought this was really cool, the way that they do everything, and sort of Mai sort of ending the fight with the books and her being a teacher and stuff like that. So that's a nice way to do it.
Yeah, so let's address the line here. Like I said, it's the big thing that certain people seem to have an issue with was May saying the line, "Another Azula fan for the garbage heap." And this went around the first couple of days of release, and certain fans, mainly Azula fans, interpreting this line in the book as meta commentary on the fan base, that this is Faith Aaron Hicks writing a shot at Azula fans into an official Avatar comic. And so this panel in particular was being spread around the place, I think in a lot of cases a bit out of context for some people, but then even in context, just kind of like, where are you guys getting this from? Because again, I feel I had a somewhat unique experience with the book where like I got it early, like many months early. I in no way interpreted this scene in this way, like at all. Because to me, the simple analysis of the scene is, what's the Dai Li agent talking about on the previous page? He's talking crazily about how like she's the true Fire Lord. We're waiting for her return. She'll reward us. She'll punish the betrayers and stuff like that. He's overboard. He's going crazy in on Azula as the ultimate leader. And we know from just a few scenes ago how May feels about that. She's like, why would you follow Azula? Azula is this failed leader ultimately. So the scene is just May mocking this agent for his kind of obsessive focus on Azula by diminishing him by calling him an Azula fan. That he's not some Azula loyalist or follower. He's a fan of Azula, the way he's talking, and it's fitting for May to say something like that. And again, the context is quite simple. She throws a book at him because she's a teacher, like you said. Like it's her finishing the fight with the academics, basically, type thing. It's pretty clear what the point is, and in my mind, what it isn't. So I suppose the first question is, did you at all read into this line in that way, that it was fandom commentary?
No, but I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm not enough of a Azula fan to sort of dive that deep into that sort of statement. I mean, I've read the sort of poster after you sent it to me, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. But yeah, I don't know. It seemed like this was more about the fans sort of like in universe that were sort of really about sort of Azula and sort of what she, supposedly sort of stood for, that Mai would, pretty obviously not be for, because, Mai just is sort of done with Azula and her sort of antics at this point in time. I don't know, maybe there can be some sort of resolution there. I think Tylee would probably be able to have, with her personality, be able to be better okay with trying to come to some sort of agreement with Azula, maybe, but even she's been hurt a lot there. So I don't know. But yeah, I didn't take this as sort of a real world commentary on the character in terms of, Azula and, how people view her as a character outside of, the actual comic universe here. So no, I didn't take it in that sort of way. I didn't even read into that. I had to double take to sort of find where that was in the comic. I thought it was later on, actually.
Yeah, so this prompted a response from the writer, Faith Erin Hicks. It seems like, I think some people asked about this, and then I think she became aware that it was a bit of a thing going a little bit viral, that like a decent number of people were thinking that this was the intent from the book. And so we don't usually get official responses from kind of authors about this sort of stuff, but she felt like she had to here, because in this case, like, I think that's basically like an accusation at the writer to say something like that, to interpret a scene in that way, that like you're insulting fans. That's a tough thing, I think, to try and honestly portray as, especially for Azula fans. I think to say this about Faith Erin Hicks, when I think Azula in the Spirit Temple is actually quite well regarded by even the most hardcore like Azula fans, who maybe have very specific tastes. So it's like, why are you trying to insult like ultimately like your greatest ally in like the writing department, who's actually writing Azula really, really well? So what she said on Blue Sky was, I usually don't engage with Avatar fandom stuff. However, people have been coming into my mentions, and this particular stuff is really over the top. So, just to clear a couple things up. One, May's comment about Azula fans in Ashes of the Academy is her opinion, not mine. I don't think I need to point this out, but May and Azula don't have a great relationship post-show. She might have strong opinions about Azula followers. 2, I cannot emphasize enough that May's line is not some sort of meta-commentary on fandom. May is literally throwing shade during a fight scene. And 3, I'm an Azula fan, big fan of hers, one of my favorite characters in the show, one of my top 10 villains of all time. I freaking love Azula. So if anyone's getting tossed on the garbage heap, it's me. It's my garbage heap. I'm queen of the Azula garbage mountain. Thank you for your time. And it's one of those things where this shouldn't have to happen, because I think you need to be able to trust fans not to take interpretations from books that are insulting writers in this way, that like the people making the books dislike the fandom and would write that into like official content. But given that this stuff was out there, I think she had to respond to it, given the specifics of this. I think it's a really good statement, because it's making it super clear, to the point, without I think causing maybe more of an issue to be made of it. I think she caught it like relatively early, and I think it has helped the discussion since then, because I think a few people have kind of calmed down and reflected on it, and maybe realized that they had a little bit too much of an emotional maybe initial read through of the comic. And I think things have ultimately calmed down in the aftermath of this, but it's always unfortunate when like a writer kind of feels like they have to do a bit of almost damage control just because the fandom is being a bit weird sometimes. But what are your thoughts on the fact that an official statement from a writer had to be made about like fandom reaction to a scene in a comic?
Yeah, no, I agree that I don't know, it's just something of our current times and how we're interacting with media where things can definitely seem to get blown sort of out of proportion in terms of how how things are being said in the story. And yeah, I mean, to some degree, any story from any creator is going to have some of their own sort of personal ideas into the sort of story there. But the general idea and the hope is that they're writing the characters to the best of the ability, true to sort of what we've seen from them in the past, and what they're leading towards going to the future, which of course us as fans are not really privy to any of the sort of future sort of outlook of how characters are going to view things going forward here. So who knows, the exact sort of specifics behind that line and what it could mean toward the future of, Maya as a character and sort of Azula in the future and things like that. Like this could, be something very specific, or it could be something very sort of inconsequential in sort of the grand scheme of things. But it is, what we have right now. So of course we can tend to sort of latch onto it in sort of the moment here. I've seen this a couple of places, but I haven't seen it sort of blown out so much since you've sort of mentioned it to me and I've been looking it up. So I don't know. It's interesting that this sort of was brought out to sort of the forefront of things and sort of garnered a sort of like direct response of things. But I don't think it's, seems like it's anything, specifically sort of malicious, especially considering most of the sort of, people that it would have had to gone through to get to this point in this story. But, things do slip through, but I don't think this is one of those things.
Yeah, and then like even if you go with the idea that like it is a meta commentary, like it's not much of a meta commentary. It's just like you're criticizing a specific subset of the Avatar fandom. Like, in what way, to what aim, why? When this is the same writer of the actually kind of relatively well praised like specific Azula comic. There's just I think a weirdness surrounding some of that stuff, just in terms of, again, like Azula's not the focus of this book. She's present in it a decent amount to a certain degree, given that she doesn't have a sort of present day appearance in the book. But it's just, again, the hyper specific requirements that certain fans I think have for the portrayal of Azula can be a little bit all over the place. And that I think the core of the issue that Azula fans seem to have with this book is that, unlike Spirit Temple, it's maybe not as focused on the sympathetic view of Azula, but that's because that book's from Azula's perspective versus this book's from May's perspective, and she doesn't have the best relationship with Azula post-show. So that's why you're maybe not seeing as much of that. But there's still some of it here. Like, the Ursa scene at the start is clearly like, Ursa reflecting on, like, if only Azula didn't go to the academy or different stuff didn't happen, things would be different. I might have a relationship with my daughter. She might not be out there doing whatever, that sort of idea. Even May, as we talked about in the scene like a little bit ago, is reflecting on the idea of, I don't know why Azula does some of the things that she does. Like, I was drawn to her at the academy. And May kind of fights for every previous pupil of the academy in this book, and that does include Azula, that the academy in its old approach has failed everyone. Azula's part of that. And I think people are maybe forgetting that as well. Not to mention, I think some of the other stuff that I think is part of what Azula fans have an issue with is maybe from earlier on in the book. There's a few times when characters make a casual, maybe negative mention of Azula, like, oh, I'm glad she's not around anymore, or something like that. Zuko makes a joke about, like, how, what does he say? It's not a guarantee that if you're related that you'll have a good relationship or you'll be treated well, as in referencing Azula.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a problem because, like, Zuko has not been treated well by Azula. It doesn't counter the fact that in The Search and in Smoke and Shadow, and I guess deep down he still wants this, he still wants a relationship with his sister, but he's allowed to, when having a casual conversation with his ex-girlfriend, who's also quite close with Azula, they're allowed to kind of have that kind of connection over, like, At least we don't have to deal with like Azula, who has, been a menace around us in the past. I get how you can maybe feel a little bit defensive about that. Like, why does the book have these little shots against her? But it's like, this is the truth of how these characters kind of see her. If she arrives open to a conversation, I don't think the characters are going to be just like dismissive of her, because Ursa wants a relationship with her. Zuko does. I think Ty Lee and May might have slightly complicated feelings, but I think would eventually want to have a conversation with Azula. So it's just, I think, almost like assessing the situation of like, is this the time in a specific scene to really bring the Azula sympathy into play? And in some cases it's not, in some cases it is. And I don't think this book really got it wrong necessarily, given what the focus was. But what are your thoughts on that? Maybe just the overall portrayal of Azula throughout this whole book.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think, there definitely is a lot of talk about that in terms of, is this sort of, painting a picture of her that's sort of less, I guess you could say, like you're saying, sympathetic from before. Like, this isn't really taking into fact her plight as a character, or maybe it is taking, some of that into it and, trying to show us that, there was a lot of different reasons to why Azula ended up the way that, she was. And this academy is just one of those many sort of reasons of why she, had those issues and sort of the breakdown, multiple sort of breakdowns, post the show. So I don't know. I think, there's still a lot that can be done with Azula's character, and I don't know what they're, I don't even have sort of like a strong enough opinion, I think, on if she should be sort of fully redeemed, or if she should be, fully villainized as sort of like a typical villain. I think, she's a nuanced character, which I think is why a lot of people do like her in the first place. Like, there's a lot that could be said about her, which I think is why I hope they still do stuff with her character, and they do, portray her in some sort of compelling way going forward. If that is in sort of like the new series, new movies and stuff like that, I think that would be a great way. I think that would be something that would be, worth dedicating some time in whatever new form of media towards exploring her character, because I think that's something that a lot of people are looking forward to. So there's something that can be done there for sure. But yeah, I don't know. I think this book tries to at least keep it at least a little bit even, not push it too far, which is, kind of what we get from most of these one shots. I think this is probably the one that does the most out of it. Like, this feels like it has, something to say, which is, good or bad depending on your point of view. So I like that they at least tried to go somewhere with this comic. It doesn't, there's no resolve in this one. Like, this is a one shot. It's pretty self-contained. There's nothing that's going to be like monstrous that comes out of this with our characters. I think it sets up Maya in a better place because she has something that she's going to do in the future. But bearing that, there's not much that this is really trying to get, us on sort of Azula's sort of character. So I don't know. I feel like it doesn't, at the very least, doesn't sort of set Azula in one sort of way where they're sort of, they can't do anything else with her character. At least I think they still have some options at this point in time.
Yeah, like I think that's probably the main thing with this book. Like, this book is not in any way, I think, meant to be like progress for Azula as a character. The progress still happened in Spirit Temple to a certain degree, in terms of like, that's what we're looking towards for Azula. This is pretty much, I would say, just status quo. Like, this is the situation we know with most of the other characters when it comes to Azula and reflecting back on her. Because again, it is Azula in the past, and like we've said a few times, this matches up with her portrayal in like the Zuko Alone flashback and stuff like that. The only thing maybe might have been, if the book had a little bit more time, maybe to contrast a little bit maybe and show maybe a flashback scene of May and Azula more as friends, maybe show Ty Lee as well. But at the same time, like, we didn't even get May and Ty Lee interacting in the flashback, really. Like, the book was not trying to do that or use that. But if it had more time, sure, because we maybe want to explore the idea of how much of a friendship is or isn't there between them all, because it's clear there is something. Because, like, say, Tylee and, say, like Azula's interaction in like the beach episode, there's clearly a friendship there. The same with May, and the way she reflected on her in this book. There's something there, but it doesn't counter like maybe some of the bad stuff that was there. And there's a discussion to be had. And in the same way that like there's a little bit of frustration with the lack of maybe progress with May and Zuko's relationship, it's the same as the Azula point, is that when are we going to get progress? When's the next time Azula is properly going to show up and have a big moment?
Yeah.
We don't know when that's going to happen. Is it a comic? Is it a one-shot comic? Can we go back to trilogies and finally do something there? Or does it have to happen in a movie? And we just, unfortunately, right now, don't know. And there's that general point of things feel a little bit directionless. But that's not really the fault of this individual comic or anything like that. This comic does a lot in a very small amount of time with a lot of different topics and angles. And that's why I think it's super impressive for what it is. But let's wrap up the comic here. There's only a few pages left. So again, it's May and Tylee sitting next to Shihan. They note that, like, oh, those were the Daily agents that Azula brought back with her. They've been waiting for her return. And again, the way May says it, and it's got the exclamation points over it, return, she's mocking once again the idea of, like, why would anyone do that? And Shihan notes, yeah, Pearl was the one hiding them. I can't believe. Tylee's like, I can. She was always a jerk. I figured it out when I first started at this school. Shihan's ashamed that it took her this long to realize. But Tylee is like, well, you made her mad enough that she sent a couple of earthbenders to kill you. I'd say you're pretty good. I suppose we need to cancel school for tomorrow. Yeah, classroom is a mess. We need to sort this out. And then Tylee looks at May, and May's like, what's with that face? Oh, you know. No, I don't know. What is it? It's you, May. I've never seen you like this before. You found something that you enjoy. You like being a teacher. And she kind of blushes at this and is like, well, I actually do. It's not that big of a deal. She does really like it. Tylee then says, I worried about you, you know? We were together for such a long time, but then I went off with the Kyoshi Warriors. I didn't want you to feel like I left you behind. I didn't. I was happy for you. And I'm happy for you too, as she hugs her, and we get the joke once again. You know how I feel about hugs? I know you love them, as we get the kind of sunset setting over the academy as May and Tylee look off into the distance. And there's a bit of a theming here with the idea that, like, it's called Ashes of the Academy. It's about, like, the darker aspects of the academy, but here's, like, a true friendship that actually did come out of it. And then there's the kind of lingering thing in the background of sort of, like, and how much of a friendship was there with Azula, and that's something that will need to be resolved whenever we get back around to addressing Azula and a potential redemption. But the bright light that is sort of like, oh, here's a good thing from the Academy for May, and we just addressed that, hey, Tylee's happy that May has found her path to the future. She found hers and was a little bit worried about her, and now she's super happy for her as well. They're both happy for each other, and it's a really nice ending. Sure, there's room for a follow-up if you want to do it rather directly, like there is with a lot of the one-shot comics, but this feels like a relatively clean ending. You maybe wonder about maybe some kind of loose ends, like, does Pearl get arrested coming out of this? Does she escape? I'm assuming because she's old enough, so she's so old that it probably is just a case that we assume in the background she gets arrested, and then there's a bit of a case of, like, if she actually is 100 years old, how does that work? How much time left does she have? There's a bunch of questions, but what are your thoughts on this final May and Tylee?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think this is a pretty good way to sort of show our characters sort of, basically like recapping on everything that sort of happened and sort of coming to the point where they think that they're actually sort of, progressing in their lives and their sort of careers and stuff like that, especially considering that Mai did seem like she was sort of like the one that was sort of like left out of things. Like Tylee went on like multiple different sort of adventures, and of course Azula has been all over the place doing, who knows what at this sort of point here. But Mai's sort of been, it almost seems like she's sort of been stuck, other than, the fact that she temporarily had, a relationship with Zuko. This seems to be sort of her new thing here. So I like that their relationship, their friendship from, the academy was seemingly one of the bright spots concerning everything that went, down during the academy here, which, It seems odd considering their personalities are so sort of, opposite of each other, but, opposites attract and all that. So I don't know. I thought this was a good way to sort of, wrap this up. And I think, for the most part, the things that are, sort of shown in this, specific comic, I think are pretty well done and pretty well concluded. I think, it'll be interesting to see how the Academy develops over time, but I think you can see that, easily whenever we get the future, iterations of things and we see how, the Fire Nation people, act in the future going forward, which is something that we haven't really seen. We haven't really, gone back to the Fire Nation in any sort of detail to see how, they act now, other than sort of the Fire Leader, Fire Lord and the in chorus. So there's something to be said there to see how, these students act in the future or how Key's in the future. But yeah, no, I think this was a nice way to sort of wrap it up.
Yeah, like it is a big positive in terms of like it feels like, yeah, check box for educational reform in the Fire Nation. Like they're doing it. You know, maybe we'd like to go back to the headband school and see like how things go over there,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the like more elite kind of capital focused academy. But the assumption would be that this works, kind of spread it around type thing. And there's also like the idea, like, yeah, it creates a pretty obvious maybe trajectory for May as a character, where like she really likes this. Does she stay on long enough that she becomes the new headmistress when Shihan retires? When/where does the Zuko May relationship happen? And then does she stay in that position? Does she take up a more maybe government kind of position as Fire Lady when maybe they get married and become the, I don't know, the Minister of Education or something like that in the Fire Nation? There's at least that path there now that is more than just shippy ship the relationship, and it's all about that and not about the characters. At least here, like, May has that trajectory, and now the relationship, whenever it happens, is this bonus over the top because the character's been covered in terms of an arc kind of going forward, which I think is the main success coming out of this book and what like needed. And in that sense, that's why I think this is the most successful one-shot comic, because it's a character who needed something and they did something big with them, and you come out like with a much better understanding of May as a character overall. So I'm very, very pleased with this book overall. Sure, we all want follow-ups to basically like all of the one-shot comics, and that's just a general comic problem because we don't know what the direction is, and we're going to have to wait and see like what the next comics are. Like, is it one-shots 7 next for Avatar, just another trilogy, because of maybe the timing on when this is going to release in the build-up and the actual release of the movie? Are we back to trilogies? What's this comic mini-series that we're still waiting to be announced? And just what is the future of the comics now that the actual big content is on the verge of happening? Because you would define the last time we had a show as being the era where the comics were doing big things. Can that happen again when the new stuff starts to come out? It's not super clear right now, but things are getting better. They're, broadly speaking, I think, in a good spot. It's just, I get the frustration with certain fans of specific characters that we don't know what, when, where we'll see them again. But what are your final thoughts on Ashes of the Academy?
Yeah, no, I think overall it's a good comic in terms of giving us a character, like you're saying, who didn't really have anywhere that they were going, somewhere that they can go now, that hopefully will build in them being sort of a more sort of important role of our sort of, mostly, major characters that we, really liked and had a really strong presence in the original show, and hopefully will continue to have a pretty strong presence in, future sort of media. I think it is unfortunate that we're not really completely sure how the comics are going to go in the future, because, there's a lot of moving parts into this franchise that's been sort of essentially sort of revitalized and is becoming, more involved in sort of the current day compared to where it was, 10, 20, whatever amount of years ago. But no, I thought this was on its own a good one. It probably is one of my more favorite ones of all of these sort of one shots, which I think is pretty good. At least they're getting better. They fluctuate, but they're getting better.
Yep, definitely. It makes me very eager to see what's next. We have nothing really to go on because it would be the start of a new trilogy. I think there's probably the heavy assumption it will just be another one-shot trilogy. with the same creative team. We've done quite a few characters now at this point, so who's really left? What's the theming going to be? Well, straight away, like I'm still on the last few pages of the book, Ty Lee hasn't had a one-shot. And it would be nice to have, you know, a situation where Azula, May, and Ty Lee all have individual one-shots, because I'd like a little bit more focus on the Kyoshi Warriors, especially from someone who's maybe newer to the group. Like, they go on like a separate mission. Is it to hunt down Azula? There's still a way to bring Azula in, because that's Ty Lee's current mission. Or something else. Like, you can always bring her family back into play with all of her twin sisters and stuff like that. That could be nice. I think Sokka probably could do with one, because of the main cast. Like, he was never really the focus of any of the main comic arcs, even North and South, so a solo comic feels like something he needs. And if you do Sokka and Ty Lee, maybe it's a non-bender theming, and you can do, I don't know, Teo teams up with like Aang for a comic or something like that. And that way you get your kind of Aang, but you also get your kind of Bounty Hunter and the Tea Brewer-esque one, where you bring a minor character in, and that's your trilogy, like the non-bender focused one. Maybe. Hard to predict, though. What are your thoughts, though? Are any characters that you really want them to do one of the next Avatar one-shots about?
Oh, that's good. I mean, Tylee would be a fan favorite one that would work out pretty well, but I think considering her current mission, I think that might be too much, you know, pushing this sort of story for overall. I think it would have to be character that unfortunately wouldn't move things, you know, along, considering, you know, most of the new projects that they have coming up. But I don't know. I think I'm really curious in general, just the timing of the new project. If it comes out, you know, closer to when, you know, presumably the movies are coming out, or if they're really just sort of going to, I don't know, just throw something out there just to keep sort of the idea in people's mind that the comics and make them more sort of relevant to things. I think, you know, hope they just don't sort of like stop and put it on the white side, because there, you know, there's a lot that they could do, but I don't know. It feels like maybe they could come to a point where they're just really waiting to start off the next sort of bigger project of series of things, especially if it's going to tie in with, you know, some of the current new big projects. I think that might lead it more toward it being more like the three-parters of something completely new. But I don't know. There's a lot they can do.
Yeah, it'd also be nice just to see, like, yeah, if the closeness to the Avatar Studios projects maybe opens up the timeline a little bit, where I think we're all the comics are pretty much stuck in on the official timeline, the year 9932. All basically everything is set there. We at some point it feels like we have to bridge the gap between the current comic timeline and the 7-8 years into the future that the movie's going to be. So is that now a free patch for them to work in, and maybe one shots with slightly older characters is a way to do that? Maybe that's what the comic miniseries is. That's the sort of stuff we want to see, because it does feel like to a certain degree a lot of these bigger plots probably just need a little bit of time. Azula needs some time to, I guess, create another group, fail again, another group, fail again, to get her to the point where, you know, when you hit your lowest point, you're open to the greatest change type thing. And that's maybe when her arc can happen. Mm-hmm. Same with Mei and Zuko. They just need a bit more time, and then maybe like the romantic kind of sparks can kind of happen again. So we once again look forward to the future of comics, because right now we have no new content really on the horizon. There is the free Comic Book Day book in May, but that's like a random side story with like Ronin, Momo, and Samurai Appa. That I guess is going to be some weird non-canon dream scenario. So not really high expectations there. So we're completely waiting for the next Avatar comic, Korra comic, that comic miniseries, and anything else they want to add to the lineup of comics. I don't know when this stuff is actually going to get announced. Based off the Beasts announcements, at the very least, you can see that, okay, book announced for September. So they've still got space towards the end of the year to announce some stuff for like October, November, December. And I would really hope they get at least one more book out this, if possible. Not sure where the scheduling is for the Korra comics, just because it seems like that art maybe takes a little bit longer to do. But the Faith Aaron Hicks, Peter Wortman team, maybe they can get another book out this year. We have to wait and see. But overall, that's been episode 288 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.